The wagon jolted over a broken stone, and Alara Whitfield gripped the wooden rail so hard her knuckles turned white. Rain hammered the canvas roof above her head, and through a gap in the fabric she could see the black towers of Blackthorn Castle rising against the storm clouds, like the teeth of some enormous beast. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was certain the 2 guards sitting across from her could hear it. "Faster," one of the guards barked at the driver. "The king does not like to wait." Alara pressed her back against the cold wood and tried to steady her breathing. 3 days ago, she had been in her father's small cottage at the edge of Fenwick Hollow, helping her mother salt fish for the winter. 3 days ago, she had never even heard the name Cale Ashgrave spoken, without someone lowering their voice first, as if saying it too loudly might summon him. Now she was being delivered to him like a sack of grain. Her father's debts had grown too large. The harvest had failed twice in a row, and when the moneylenders working under the Ashgrave banner came demanding payment, there had been nothing left to give them. Nothing except her. She remembered the moment her father told her, how he could not look her in the eye, how his voice cracked on the words, "I have no other choice, Alara." She remembered her mother weeping into her apron, and her younger brother Colin standing in the doorway, too young to understand why his sister was being led away by strangers in dark cloaks. She had not cried. Not once. She told herself that whatever happened next, she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears. The wagon lurched to a stop, and the guard closest to her stood, ducking his head beneath the low canvas ceiling. "Out," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. "We're here." Alara stepped down into the rain and looked up at Blackthorn Castle for the first time. It was even more frightening up close. Gray stone walls stretched 3 stories high, streaked black with centuries of rain, and torches burned in iron brackets despite the storm, throwing long shadows across the courtyard. Wolves, she realized, real wolves, sitting calmly near the gate, as though they were guard dogs, their golden eyes following her every step. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the Northern Territories had heard about the Ashgrave Pack, the fiercest shifters in the kingdom, ruled by a king who had never once shown mercy to anyone who crossed him. She swallowed hard and let the guards lead her through the towering front doors. Inside, the castle was just as cold as the courtyard, despite the enormous fireplaces burning in every hall. Alara's boots echoed against the stone floor as she was marched down corridor after corridor, past tapestries depicting battles she did not recognize, past suits of armor standing like silent sentries, past servants who glanced at her with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Wait here," the guard said finally, stopping her outside a set of enormous double doors, carved with the image of a snarling wolf. "The king will see you when he is ready." Alara waited. She did not know how long. It felt like hours, standing alone in that drafty corridor, her simple travel dress, still damp from the rain, her stomach twisted into knots. She thought about running. She thought about all the terrible things people said about Cale Ashgrave, how he had taken the throne by force, how he showed no warmth to anyone, not even his own advisors, how the last person who had tried to defy him had simply disappeared and was never spoken of again. She thought about her family, waiting back in Fenwick Hollow, finally safe from the debt collectors because of what she was about to do. She did not run. When the doors finally opened, a servant with kind eyes and a nervous expression beckoned her inside. "The king is waiting," the woman whispered. "Try not to speak unless he asks you a question, and whatever you do, do not look him directly in the eyes for too long. He does not like that." Alara nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard, she thought it might burst from her chest. The throne room was vast, lit by a roaring fire at the far end, and a scattering of torches along the walls. The ceiling stretched so high it disappeared into shadow, and at the far end of the room, seated on a throne made of dark wood and iron, was the man she had traveled 3 days to meet. Cale Ashgrave did not look up when she entered. He was younger than she had expected, though every inch of him radiated a kind of controlled, dangerous power that made the air in the room feel heavier. His dark hair was cut short and practical, his jaw sharp, his shoulders broad beneath a black coat that seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it. He was reading something, a letter or a report, and he did not so much as glance at her as she approached. Alara stopped a respectful distance from the throne and waited, unsure what she was supposed to do. Bow? Speak? She had received no instructions beyond, "Do not look him in the eyes for too long." Finally, Cale set down the paper he had been reading. His eyes, a striking shade of gray that reminded her of storm clouds, finally lifted to meet hers. "You are the payment from Fenwick Hollow," he said. His voice was low, even, and utterly without warmth. "Yes, my lord," Elara answered, proud that her voice did not shake, even though her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were trembling. Cale studied her for a long moment, and Elara forced herself not to look away, even as every instinct screamed at her to stare at the floor instead. "Your father owed a significant debt," Cale said. "I trust you understand what that means for you now." "I understand that I belong to you," Elara said quietly, "until the debt is repaid." Something flickered across Cale's face, so brief that Elara almost missed it. Surprise, perhaps. Most people who stood before him, she guessed, did not speak so plainly. "Take her to the West Wing," Cale said, turning his attention back to the papers on his lap, as though the conversation had already ended. "See that she is given a room, and does not wander where she is not permitted." The kind-eyed servant, whose name Elara would later learn was Marta, gently touched her elbow and guided her out of the throne room. Elara did not look back, though she could feel the weight of Cale Ashgrave's silence following her all the way to the doors. The West Wing, it turned out, was far from luxurious. Elara's new room was small, with stone walls, a narrow bed, and a single window that looked out over a courtyard she was apparently not allowed to enter. Marta explained the rules in a hushed voice, as though the walls themselves might be listening. Elara was not to leave the West Wing without permission. She was not to speak to the king unless spoken to first. She was to report to the kitchens each morning, to help with whatever tasks were assigned to her. "Is he always so cold?" Elara asked, before she could stop herself. Marta's expression tightened. "The king has his reasons," she said carefully. "It is not our place to question them. Get some rest, child. Tomorrow will be a long day." That night, Elara lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the wind howl outside her window, and, somewhere in the distance, the low, mournful sound of a wolf's call. She thought about her family, about the debt that was now paid, about the strange, cold king who had barely looked at her twice. She told herself this was simply her life now. She would survive it, the way she had survived every hardship before this one. She would make herself small, unnoticed, useful enough to be tolerated, and unremarkable enough to be ignored. It was, she decided, the safest way to endure whatever came next. She had no way of knowing that somewhere else in that vast, cold castle, Cale Ashgrave had not returned to his papers after she left the throne room. Instead, he had sat in silence for a long while, staring at the fire, his mind circling back again and again to something he could not quite place, a feeling, a flicker of familiarity in the girl's face that he could not explain and did not want to examine too closely. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself that every day, dozens of people passed through his halls, and none of them mattered enough to occupy his thoughts once they were out of sight. But that night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cale Ashgrave found himself unable to sleep. The next morning came gray and cold, and Elara woke before dawn out of habit, the way she always had on the farm. For a moment, lying in the unfamiliar bed, she forgot where she was. Then the stone walls and narrow window reminded her all at once, and the knot in her stomach returned. She dressed quickly in the plain gray servant's dress that had been left for her and made her way toward the kitchens, following the directions Marta had given her the night before. The castle felt different in the early morning light, less menacing somehow, filled with the sounds of servants beginning their daily work, the clatter of pots, the murmur of quiet conversation. The head cook, a stern but not unkind woman named Bridget, put her to work immediately, peeling vegetables and hauling water from the well in the inner courtyard. Elara did not mind the labor. It was familiar at least, a small comfort in a place that felt entirely foreign to her in every other way. It was during her third trip to the well that she first noticed the guard watching her. He was young, not much older than herself, with sandy hair, and an expression that seemed friendlier than most of the castle's stern-faced staff. He did not approach her, only nodded once when she glanced his way, but Elara felt a small measure of relief knowing that not everyone within these walls regarded her the way Cale Ashgrave had, as though she were simply an item to be catalogued and stored. She learned his name later that day. Finn, one of the younger members of the king's personal guard, assigned to patrol the West Wing where she had been housed. "You're new," Finn said when their paths crossed again near the kitchen entrance, his tone casual despite the fact that guards were not supposed to fraternize with servants. "From Fenwick Hollow, right? I heard the king took on a new debt payment." Alara felt her face flush at the blunt way he described what had happened to her, though she supposed there was no kinder way to say it. "Yes," she said simply. "That's me." "Don't worry too much," Finn said, lowering his voice. "He's harsh, the king, but he's fair, in his own way. He doesn't hurt people without reason. Just stay out of his sight as much as you can, and you'll be fine." It was not exactly comforting advice, but Alara appreciated the honesty behind it more than she would have appreciated an empty promise. She thanked him and continued on with her work, carrying the heavy water buckets back toward the kitchen, her arms aching by the time she finally set them down. The days that followed fell into a similar pattern. Alara woke before dawn, worked in the kitchens and around the castle grounds, and retreated to her small room each night, exhausted but grateful for the routine. She caught glimpses of Cale Ashgrave from a distance, striding through the halls with his advisors trailing behind him, his expression always the same unreadable mask. He never looked her way. She told herself that suited her perfectly well. It was nearly 2 weeks into her time at Blackthorn Castle when everything changed. She had been sent to deliver a tray of bandages and healing salves to the king's private study, after the regular healer, an elderly man named Osric, had fallen ill with a fever and could not attend to his usual duties. Alara had protested, insisting she knew nothing about tending wounds, but Bridget had simply pressed the tray into her hands and told her the king would not tolerate excuses. "He was injured in training this morning," Bridget explained hurriedly, as she pushed Alara toward the door. "A cut on his forearm, nothing serious, but Osric usually cleans it properly so it doesn't fester. Just do your best, girl. The king does not have patience for delays." Alara's stomach twisted with dread as she made her way toward the private study, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. She had barely exchanged more than a dozen words with Cale Ashgrave since her arrival, and the thought of tending to his injury, of standing close enough to touch him, filled her with a nervous energy she could not quite name. She knocked softly on the study door, and a low voice bid her enter. Cale was seated near the window, his coat discarded over the back of a chair, his shirt sleeve rolled up to reveal a long, shallow cut along his forearm. He glanced up when she entered, his gray eyes narrowing slightly. "Where is Osric?" he asked. "He has taken ill, my lord," Alara answered, keeping her eyes carefully fixed on the tray in her hands, rather than meeting his gaze. "Bridget sent me in his place." For a moment, she thought he might refuse her help entirely and send her away. Instead, he simply gestured toward the chair beside him. "Then see to it properly," he said. "I have no interest in an infection slowing me down." Alara set the tray down on the small table beside his chair and knelt before him, her hands unsteady as she reached for the bandages. She had helped tend minor injuries before, on the farm, when her brother scraped his knees, or her father cut himself while working, but this felt entirely different. She was acutely aware of every small movement, of how close she was sitting to him, of the tension radiating from his powerful frame, despite his outward stillness. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, applying the salve Bridget had prepared, her fingers brushing against his skin as she worked. Cale did not flinch, did not make a sound, simply watched her with an intensity that made her hands tremble even more. As she reached for the bandage to wrap around his forearm, her own sleeve slipped upward slightly, exposing her wrist. And that was when Cale Ashgrave went very, very still. Alara did not notice at first, too focused on her task, carefully winding the bandage around his arm. It was only when she glanced up, wondering why he had gone so quiet, that she saw the look on his face. His gray eyes were fixed not on her face but on her wrist, on the small, crescent-shaped birthmark that had been there for as long as she could remember, a pale silver mark just below the base of her palm. "Where did you get that mark?" Cale asked, his voice tight in a way she had not heard from him before. Alara blinked, startled by the sudden shift in his tone. "I was born with it, my lord," she said carefully. "My mother always said it was there, since the day I came into the world." Cale said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tightening, his eyes still locked on the mark as though it were something impossible, something that should not exist. Alara felt a chill run down her spine, unsure what she had done to provoke such a reaction, unsure whether she had somehow made a terrible mistake. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the intensity in his expression vanished, replaced by the same cold, controlled mask she had grown accustomed to seeing. "Finish the bandage," he said curtly, pulling his arm back slightly, though not entirely out of her reach. "And send for Osric the moment he recovers. I do not require your assistance again." Alara finished her work in silence, her mind racing with questions she did not dare ask aloud. When she finally gathered the tray and made her way toward the door, she risked one last glance back at the king. He was staring out the window, his expression distant, his uninjured hand clenched into a fist at his side, as though he were fighting to hold something back, something that had nothing to do with the wound she had just tended. Alara left the study with her heart pounding, the memory of that strange, intense look in his eyes following her all the way back to her room. She told herself it meant nothing, that perhaps the king simply disliked being touched, or found her clumsy handling of the bandage irritating. But some small part of her, the part she could not quite silence, knew that whatever had just happened in that study had very little to do with the wound on his arm, and everything to do with the mark on her wrist. That night, sleep did not come easily to either of them. In her small room in the West Wing, Alara lay awake, replaying the strange encounter over and over in her mind, and in his private chambers, high above the rest of the castle, Cale Ashgrave sat by his own fire, long after midnight, staring at nothing, his thoughts pulled backward through the years, to a memory he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. A memory of fire and smoke, and a small girl with a crescent mark on her wrist, whom he had once sworn, in the chaos of the worst night of his life, that he would never let anyone hurt again. Neither of them yet understood how deeply their paths were about to become entangled. But something had shifted that evening in the quiet of the king's study. A single thread pulled loose from a tapestry of the past, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. Cale Ashgrave did not sleep that night, and he did not sleep well for many nights after. The mark on Alara's wrist had opened a door in his mind that he had spent years trying to seal shut, and no matter how hard he tried to focus on the affairs of his kingdom, his thoughts kept drifting back to a memory, buried so deep, he had almost convinced himself it belonged to someone else. He had been 12 years old when his home was destroyed. Back then, he was not a king, not even close to one. He was simply a boy named Cale, who lived in a small pack settlement far to the north, in the shadow of the mountains, with a mother who sang while she cooked, and a father who taught him how to track deer through fresh snow. It was a simple life, a happy one, and Cale had never imagined it could end. Until the night the raiders came. He remembered very little of the attack itself, only fragments, the way memory often works when the mind tries to protect itself from something too painful to hold whole. He remembered smoke filling the air. He remembered screaming, and the sound of wolves fighting in the darkness, and his father's voice shouting at him to run. He remembered grabbing the hand of a small girl, younger than himself, who had been staying with her family as guests in the settlement, and pulling her away from the flames. He remembered her crying, and he remembered telling her, with the foolish confidence of a frightened child trying to be brave, that he would not let anything happen to her. He remembered noticing the strange silver mark on her wrist as he held her hand, shaped like a crescent moon, and thinking it was pretty, the kind of thing a child notices even in the middle of chaos. And then he remembered nothing else. Only waking up in a stranger's camp days later, told that his parents were gone, that his home had been burned to the ground, and that he would be raised among the very pack that had taken him captive, trained to fight, trained to survive, trained to become the kind of ruler who would never again be powerless, the way he had been powerless that night. He never learned what happened to the girl. In the confusion of the attack, she had been separated from him, and no one he asked afterward seemed to know or care what became of her. For years, he told himself it did not matter. He had far greater concerns, clawing his way up through the ranks of a pack that valued strength above all else, until he had eventually taken the throne of Blackthorn Kingdom for himself, uniting the northern territories under a single, iron rule. He had built himself into someone untouchable, someone who did not allow memories of a burning village and a crying little girl to interfere with the decisions he needed to make as king. He had told himself, for nearly 20 years, that the girl with the crescent mark was simply another casualty of a night he could not change, and that dwelling on her fate served no purpose. But now she was here, in his castle, working in his kitchens, and the mark on her wrist was unmistakable, exactly as he remembered it, down to the smallest curve. It could be a coincidence, he told himself over and over, during those sleepless nights. Crescent-shaped birthmarks were not entirely unheard of. It was possible, even likely, that he was simply a grown man, allowing an old wound to distort his judgment, seeing connections that did not exist, because some deeply buried part of him wanted them to be real. And yet, the way she carried herself, the particular shade of her eyes, somewhere between brown and gold, exactly the way he remembered the little girl's eyes catching the firelight all those years ago. The soft cadence of her voice, which struck something familiar in him he could not quite place. None of it was proof, not really. But together, it was enough to keep him awake, staring at his ceiling, turning the impossible question over and over in his mind. Could she be that same girl? 3 days after the incident in his study, Cale summoned Marta to his private chambers, a request unusual enough that the older servant arrived looking distinctly nervous, wringing her hands as she waited for him to speak. "Tell me what you know of the girl from Fenwick Hollow," Cale said without preamble. "Alara, her family, her history, anything you have learned since her arrival." Marta blinked, clearly startled by the request. "My lord, I know very little. She has mentioned a mother, a father, a younger brother named Colin. Her family has lived in Fenwick Hollow for generations, as far as I understand. Beyond that, she has said very little about herself. She keeps to her work, and does not speak much of her past. Has she ever mentioned anything unusual about her childhood? A time before Fenwick Hollow, perhaps? Any gaps in her memory, or stories that seem incomplete?" Marta hesitated, clearly trying to recall any relevant detail. "Now that you mention it, my lord, I did overhear her once, speaking with one of the kitchen girls, saying that she has almost no memories from before the age of 5 or 6. She said it was as though her earliest years were simply missing, like a book with the first several pages torn out. But I assumed that was not so unusual. Many people struggle to remember much from such a young age." Cale's jaw tightened, and he dismissed Marta without further explanation, his mind churning with the new information. Missing memories. A gap in her earliest years, right around the time the raid on his settlement had taken place. It was not proof, but it was another thread pulling him toward a conclusion he was not yet ready to accept. He needed more information, and he was not willing to trust anyone else with the task of gathering it, not when the stakes felt as personal and as fragile as this. Over the following days, Cale began finding reasons to be near Alara, though he was careful never to let his interest appear obvious, even to himself. He would find excuses to pass through the kitchens during her work hours. He noticed things he had not bothered to notice before: the careful, patient way she handled even the most menial tasks, the quiet kindness she showed to the other servants despite her own difficult circumstances, the way she never complained, even when the work was hard, and her hands grew raw from scrubbing pots late into the evening. He told himself he was simply gathering evidence, testing a theory, nothing more. But some part of him, a part he did not examine too closely, found himself drawn to her in a way that had nothing to do with the mark on her wrist, or the memories of a burning village. Alara, for her part, noticed the change in the king's behavior almost immediately, though she could not begin to guess the reason behind it. Where before he had ignored her presence entirely, now she would catch him watching her from across a courtyard, or lingering near the kitchen doorway longer than any errand could reasonably require. It unsettled her, though not entirely in a bad way. There was something in his gaze that felt less like scrutiny, and more like searching, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle only he could see. "You've caught the king's attention," Bridget remarked one afternoon, not unkindly, as she watched Alara scrub the same pot for far longer than necessary, while lost in thought. "I've worked in this castle for 15 years, girl, and I have never once seen him take notice of a kitchen servant the way he's taken notice of you." "I don't know what I've done to earn it," Alara admitted, setting the pot aside. "Ever since I bandaged his arm, he looks at me as though I remind him of something. Or someone." Bridget's expression grew thoughtful, though she said nothing further on the matter, and Alara did not press her. She had learned quickly that the servants of Blackthorn Castle rarely spoke openly about their king, whether out of loyalty, fear, or simply long habit. Whatever secrets Cale Ashgrave carried, it seemed the entire castle had learned to keep them buried alongside him. That evening, as Alara made her way back toward the West Wing after finishing her duties, she found her path blocked, quite unexpectedly, by the king himself. He stood in the corridor, his expression unreadable in the dim torchlight, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Alara's heart began to race, though she could not have said whether it was from fear or something else entirely. "My lord," she said finally, bowing her head slightly, unsure what else was expected of her. "Walk with me," Cale said, and though his tone carried the same command he used with everyone, there was something almost gentle beneath it, that she had not heard from him before. Alara followed him, uncertain and curious in equal measure, as he led her through a part of the castle she had never seen, past a set of heavy doors that opened onto a private garden enclosed by high stone walls. Moonlight spilled across neatly trimmed hedges and a small, quiet fountain at the garden's center, and despite everything, Alara found herself momentarily struck by the beauty of it. "This was my mother's garden," Cale said quietly, surprising her with the admission. "Before she died. I do not bring many people here." Alara did not know how to respond, so she simply waited, sensing that he had more to say and did not wish to be interrupted. "I want to ask you something," Cale continued, turning to face her fully, for the first time since they had entered the garden. "And I need you to answer honestly, no matter how strange the question might seem." "Of course, my lord," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember anything from before you came to live in Fenwick Hollow? Anything at all? Even fragments? Even things that seem impossible, or make no sense?" The question caught Alara entirely off guard, and for a long moment, she simply stared at him, trying to understand why such a thing would matter to the king of Blackthorn Kingdom. But something in his expression, the raw uncertainty beneath his usually composed features, told her this was not an idle question. This mattered to him deeply. "I remember very little," she admitted slowly, searching her own mind as she spoke, as though trying to grasp hold of something that had always slipped through her fingers before. "There are pieces, fire, I think, smoke, the sound of people shouting, and someone holding my hand, telling me not to be afraid." She paused, her brow furrowing as she tried to pull the fragments into something more coherent. "I always assumed they were simply nightmares, bad dreams that felt more real than they should have. My mother, the woman who raised me in Fenwick Hollow, always told me I came to them as a very small child, an orphan from a village further north that had been destroyed. She and my father took me in and raised me as their own. I never questioned it further. I suppose I never wanted to." Cale's expression had grown very still as she spoke, and when she finished, he said nothing for a long moment, simply staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. "What was the name of the boy?" he asked finally, his voice low. "In your memory. The one who held your hand and told you not to be afraid." Alara blinked, startled by the specificity of the question. "I don't remember a name," she said slowly. "It was so long ago, and I was so young. I only remember that he was brave, and that he promised he would protect me." She hesitated, studying Cale's face, noticing for the first time how tightly his jaw was clenched, how his gray eyes had darkened with something that looked almost like pain. "Why are you asking me this, my lord? What does it mean to you?" Cale turned away from her, walking a few paces toward the fountain, his back to her, as he seemed to gather himself before speaking again. 20 years ago, he said finally, "my home was destroyed in a raid, very similar to the fragments you just described. I was 12 years old. I remember holding the hand of a small girl during the chaos, a girl with a crescent-shaped mark on her wrist, exactly like the one you carry. I promised her I would protect her, and then we were separated, and I never learned what became of her." He turned back to face Alara, and for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn Castle, she saw something in his expression that was neither cold nor commanding, but achingly, unmistakably human. "I have spent 20 years believing I failed to keep that promise, and now I find myself wondering if the girl I failed to protect has been standing in my kitchens this entire time, and I did not even recognize her." Alara felt the breath leave her lungs entirely, the garden around her seeming to tilt slightly as the weight of his words settled over her. It was impossible, she told herself. Too strange, too convenient, too much like the kind of story told to frighten or comfort children, rather than something that could actually be true. And yet, standing there in the moonlight, looking into the eyes of the man the entire kingdom feared, Ilara found herself wondering, for the first time in her life, whether the fragments of memory she had always dismissed as nightmares might in fact be the truth she had never known she was searching for. "I don't know if I am the girl from your memory," she said finally, her voice unsteady, "but I want to know. I need to know." Cale nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression, a resolve settling over his features that had not been there before. "Then we will find out together," he said. "Whatever the truth turns out to be." Neither of them spoke again, as they made their way back through the quiet corridors of the castle. But something had changed between them in that moonlit garden, a fragile thread of connection neither of them had expected to find, born from a shared tragedy neither of them had ever fully understood. And though neither could have known it yet, the truth they were both searching for would prove to be far more complicated and far more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The following morning, Cale summoned his most trusted advisor, an older man named Edmund Fairley, who had served the Ashgrave throne since before Cale had taken it for himself. Edmund had been a young soldier on the night of the raid 2 decades earlier, one of only a handful of survivors from the pack that had rescued Cale and raised him afterward, and if anyone in the castle might remember details of that night, it would be him. "You wish to speak of the northern raid," Edmund said, settling into the chair across from Cale's desk with the careful movements of a man whose joints had grown stiff with age. "It has been many years since anyone has asked me about that night, my lord. May I ask what has brought it to your mind after so long?" Cale considered how much to reveal, then decided that Edmund, of all people, deserved honesty. "I believe I may have found her," he said. "The girl, the one I tried to protect before we were separated." Edmund's weathered face registered genuine surprise, followed by something more thoughtful. "The girl with the mark," he said slowly. "I remember you speaking of her when you were young. Though you stopped mentioning her after a time, I assumed the memory had simply faded, as such things often do for children who endure great loss." "It did not fade," Cale said quietly. "I simply learned it was easier not to speak of things I could not change. But now there is a servant girl in this castle, sent as payment for a debt owed by her family in Fenwick Hollow, and she carries the same mark. She has fragments of memory that align with that night. I need to know more, Edmund. I need to know what happened to the survivors, where they were taken, whether any records exist of what became of them." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "It was chaos, my lord, as I am sure you remember better than most. Many families were scattered that night. Some fled south, others were taken in by neighboring packs. I do recall, now that you mention it, hearing that a small group of survivors, mostly women and children, made their way toward the eastern territories. It is possible one of them eventually settled somewhere near Fenwick Hollow, though I could not say for certain without consulting whatever records still exist from that period." "Find them," Cale said. "Whatever records remain, whatever survivors can still be located and questioned. I need to know the truth." Edmund rose slowly from his chair, his expression grave. "I will do what I can, my lord, though I must ask, if I may be so bold, what you intend to do with this truth once you find it." Cale did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting toward the window and the courtyard beyond, where he could just make out Ilara's figure moving between the kitchen and the well, unaware that she was being discussed at all. "I do not know yet," he admitted finally, "but I intend to find out." Over the following week, Ilara noticed a subtle shift in her circumstances that she could not fully explain. She was moved from her small, sparse room in the west wing to a larger chamber closer to the castle's main halls, with a proper fireplace and a window that overlooked the private garden where she and Cale had spoken beneath the moonlight. Bridget assigned her lighter duties, mostly involving the castle's small library rather than the heavy labor of the kitchens, and though no one explained the reason for these changes, Ilara suspected she knew exactly where they originated. She found herself spending more time in the library than she had anticipated enjoying, surrounded by old books and scrolls that smelled of dust and age, tasked with cataloging and organizing collections that had apparently been neglected for years. It was there, during her second week in her new role, that she encountered Ophelia, a sharp-eyed young woman who served as one of the castle's few scholars. responsible for maintaining the kingdom's historical records. You're the one from Fenwick Hollow, Ophelia said without preamble, studying Alara with open curiosity, as she organized a stack of ancient ledgers. The one the king has taken an interest in. The whole castle is talking about it, you know. Servants do not typically receive private gardens and library assignments. Alara felt her cheeks warm, uncertain how to respond to such directness. I don't fully understand it myself, she admitted. The king has asked me strange questions about my past, about memories I barely remember having. I don't know what he expects to find. Ophelia's expression grew thoughtful, and she set down the ledger she had been holding. I have heard whispers, of course, about the raid that took his family when he was a boy. It is not something spoken of openly, but those of us who have served the throne long enough know the story, at least in fragments. If he believes you might be connected to that night, it would explain a great deal about his behavior these past weeks. Do you know anything about it? Alara asked, unable to hide her eagerness. The raid, I mean. What actually happened? Who was responsible? Ophelia glanced around the empty library, as though checking for unwanted listeners, before lowering her voice. What I know comes mostly from old records, and the occasional careless remark from someone who lived through it. The raid was orchestrated by a rival pack, one that had long resented the growing influence of the northern settlements. Their alpha at the time was a man named Draven Vane, ruthless and ambitious, who saw the destruction of smaller, weaker packs as a path toward expanding his own territory. He is still alive, as far as I know, ruling over the eastern borderlands with the same brutal methods that made him infamous 20 years ago. Alara felt a chill run through her at the name, though she could not have said why it affected her so deeply, given that she had no conscious memory of the man or his actions. Does the king know this? About Draven Vane? Undoubtedly, Ophelia said. It is common knowledge among the older members of the court that the animosity between Blackthorn Kingdom and the Eastern Territories stems directly from that raid. Though the two sides have maintained an uneasy peace for many years, I suspect it would not take much to reignite old hostilities, particularly if the king believed Draven Vane had any connection to more recent events. Alara thought of her family's debt, of the moneylenders who had come demanding payment under the Ashgrave banner, and a troubling thought occurred to her that she could not quite shake loose. Ophelia, she said slowly, do you know anything about how my family's debt originated? It seemed to appear so suddenly, after 2 failed harvests, and grew so quickly that we could never hope to repay it through honest means. Ophelia's expression grew more serious. I do not know the specifics of your family's situation, but I can tell you that debts of that nature are sometimes engineered deliberately, particularly when there is a reason to move a specific person into a specific place. If someone wished to ensure you ended up here, at Blackthorn Castle, manipulating your family's finances would be an effective, if cruel, way to accomplish it. The implication settled over Alara like a physical weight. If someone had deliberately orchestrated her family's downfall in order to bring her to the castle, it would mean that everything she had believed about her own arrival, the tragic but simple story of an impoverished family unable to pay its debts, was in fact part of something far larger and more calculated than she had ever imagined. But who would do such a thing? Alara asked, though even as she spoke the words, a name was already forming in her mind. And why? Ophelia did not answer immediately, her expression troubled. I do not know, she admitted finally, but I would encourage you to share your concerns with the king. If there is any truth to this theory, he deserves to know, and you deserve protection while the matter is investigated. That evening, Alara found herself once again summoned to the private garden, where Cale waited beside the quiet fountain, his expression unreadable in the fading evening light. She relayed what Ophelia had told her, watching his face carefully as she spoke, and saw the same troubled recognition settle over his features that had appeared in the library conversation. Edmund has been searching the old records, Cale said once she had finished. He believes he may have located information about the family who took in survivors from the northern raid, a family living in the eastern reaches of Fenwick Hollow's territory. If his findings are accurate, it would place you very near the location where the girl I remember was last seen. And Draven Vane, Alara said carefully. Ophelia mentioned he still rules the eastern territories. If he was responsible for the original raid, and if my family's debt was engineered rather than genuine, It would suggest he had some role in bringing me here as well. But why would he want that? What could he possibly gain from placing me in your castle? Cale's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a hardness that Alara had not heard from him since her earliest days at the castle. I do not know his exact motives, he admitted. But Draven Vane has never done anything without calculated purpose. If he orchestrated your family's debt specifically to ensure you ended up here, it would mean he either wanted me to discover the connection between us, or he wanted to use you as leverage against me in some way I have not yet uncovered. Neither possibility bodes well for your safety. Alara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. What do? We proceed carefully, Cale said. I will increase security around you, though I do not wish to draw undue attention to the reasons behind it. And I will continue investigating both the truth of your identity and the truth of whatever role Draven Vane may have played in bringing you here. But Alara, I need you to promise me something. She looked up at him, startled by the use of her name without any title attached, the first time he had addressed her so simply since her arrival. If you notice anything unusual, Cale continued, anyone showing undue interest in your movements, any strangers approaching you, anything at all that feels wrong, you must come to me immediately. I cannot protect you from a threat I do not know exists. I promise, Alara said, and she meant it entirely, though she could not have said in that moment whether her willingness to trust him stemmed from genuine belief in his concern for her safety, or from something else entirely, something that had been growing quietly between them, ever since that first strange conversation in this very garden. Over the following days, Alara found herself watching the castle grounds with new wariness, noticing details she had previously overlooked, questioning strangers' glances that had once seemed entirely innocent. She caught herself, more than once, glancing toward the castle gates whenever unfamiliar visitors arrived, wondering whether any of them might be connected to the shadowy figure of Draven Vane, whose name now seemed to hang over her like a storm cloud she could not quite see, but could feel gathering nonetheless. Cale, for his part, threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that his advisors found both reassuring and unsettling. He spent long hours with Edmund, poring over old records and correspondence, searching for any thread that might confirm or deny the growing suspicion that Draven Vane's hand lay behind recent events. He doubled the guard assigned to patrol the West Wing and the library, where Alara now spent much of her time, though he was careful to frame the increased security as a general precaution rather than something specific to her presence. And slowly, almost without either of them fully acknowledging it, the careful distance Cale had maintained since Alara's arrival began to erode. He found himself seeking her company more often than strictly necessary, using the ongoing investigation as justification for conversations that gradually became less about uncovering the truth of her past and more about simply understanding who she was as a person. He learned that she loved to read, though her family had rarely been able to afford books, and that she had taught herself to identify wild herbs and their uses from an elderly woman in Fenwick Hollow who had taken a liking to her as a child. He learned that she had a quick, dry sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly when she felt comfortable enough to let her guard down, a side of her personality that stood in sharp contrast to the careful, quiet demeanor she maintained around most of the castle's staff. He learned, though he was reluctant to fully examine what this meant, that he found himself looking forward to their conversations more than he looked forward to almost anything else in his carefully controlled, rigidly disciplined life. Alara, in turn, began to see past the cold, commanding exterior that had so terrified her during her first days at Blackthorn Castle. She noticed the exhaustion that lingered beneath his composed expression after long days spent managing the affairs of his kingdom. She noticed the genuine care he showed toward his people, even when his methods seemed harsh to outsiders, the way he insisted on personally reviewing every dispute brought before his throne, rather than delegating the responsibility to advisors who might handle such matters with less careful attention. She noticed, too, the loneliness that seemed to follow him through every corridor of his own castle, a solitude that had nothing to do with the absence of other people and everything to do with the walls he had built around himself over 2 decades of loss and responsibility. Neither of them spoke openly of the growing warmth between them, both too cautious, too aware of the uncertain circumstances surrounding Alara's presence in the castle, to acknowledge something that felt, in many ways, entirely inappropriate given the nature of her arrival. But the quiet evenings in the garden continued, growing longer with each passing week, and the careful distance both had maintained in the beginning grew thinner and thinner with every conversation, every shared silence, every unspoken understanding that passed between them. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after Ilara's arrival at Blackthorn Castle, that Edmund finally arrived with news that would change everything. Edmund arrived at Cale's study just as the sun was setting, his weathered face carrying an expression that hovered somewhere between triumph and grave concern. He carried a leather folder tucked beneath his arm, and Cale rose from his desk immediately, sensing that his old advisor had finally uncovered something of significance. "Tell me," Cale said simply. "I found records of the family," Edmund said, settling into the chair across from the desk and opening the folder with careful hands. "A couple named Aldrich and Mira Whitfield, who took in an orphan child following the raid on the northern settlement 20 years ago. The records indicate the child was found wandering near the border of the Eastern Territories, alone, malnourished, and unable to speak of what had happened to her family. The Whitfields, who were traveling through the region at the time, took pity on her, and raised her as their own daughter in Fenwick Hollow." Cale's hands tightened against the edge of his desk. "Ilara's parents," he said quietly. "It appears so, my lord. The timeline aligns precisely with the raid, and the description of the child, including a distinctive silver birthmark on her wrist, noted by the physician who examined her shortly after she was found, matches exactly what you have described." Edmund paused, his expression growing more troubled. "There is more, however, and I am afraid it confirms your suspicions regarding the debt that brought her here." "Go on." "I traced the origin of the Whitfield family's financial troubles as thoroughly as the records allowed. The failed harvests were genuine, a result of poor weather that affected much of the Northern Territories over the past 2 years. But the debt itself, the specific moneylenders who extended credit to the family and later called it due so aggressively, are not independent operators as they claim to be. They are financed through an intermediary who has ties, though carefully obscured through several layers of separation, to the Eastern Territories. To Draven Vane's court, specifically." Cale closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the confirmation of what he had already suspected but had hoped, against reasonable expectation, might prove false. "He knew," Cale said. "He knew exactly who she was, and he engineered her family's ruin, specifically to ensure she ended up here, in my castle." "It would appear so, my lord, though I confess I do not yet understand his purpose. If he wished to harm you or your kingdom, there would be far more direct methods available to him than orchestrating the arrival of a single servant girl, however significant her identity might prove to be." Cale paced toward the window, staring out at the darkening courtyard below, his mind working through the implications with the same careful, methodical precision he applied to every strategic decision affecting his kingdom. "Unless his purpose is not immediate harm," he said slowly, "but something more patient. If he intended for me to discover her identity, to form an attachment to her, he may be counting on that attachment to become a vulnerability he can exploit at a time of his choosing." Edmund's expression grew grim. "A hostage, then, or leverage, to be used when it would cause maximum damage." "Perhaps," Cale said, "or perhaps he simply wishes to remind me that he has never stopped believing the Northern Territories belong to him, and that even after 20 years, he retains the power to reach into my life and rearrange it according to his own designs." He turned back to face Edmund, his expression hardening into the cold resolve that had made him one of the most formidable rulers in the region. "Either way, I will not allow him to succeed. Increase security throughout the castle, particularly around Ilara. I want to know immediately if any unfamiliar visitors arrive, any correspondence from the Eastern Territories, anything at all that suggests Draven Vane is preparing to make his next move. And Ilara herself, my lord? Will you tell her what we have learned?" Cale considered the question for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "She deserves to know the truth, however difficult it may be to hear. She has spent her entire life believing her arrival here was simply the result of misfortune and failed harvests. She deserves to know that someone deliberately shaped the course of her life for reasons that have nothing to do with her own choices." That night, Cale found Ilara in the library, exactly where he had known he would find her, surrounded by the familiar comfort of books and scrolls that had become her refuge within the castle's imposing walls. She looked up as he entered and something in his expression must have telegraphed the seriousness of what he had come to share, because she immediately set aside the book she had been reading and rose to meet him. "You've learned something," she said, not quite a question. "Edmund found records confirming your identity," Cale said, choosing to deliver the most significant revelation first, watching her carefully for her reaction. "The couple who raised you, Aldrich and Mira Whitfield, found you as an orphan child near the eastern border, shortly after the raid on my settlement. The description matches. The timeline matches. The mark on your wrist matches. There is no longer any reasonable doubt. You are the girl I tried to protect that night." Alara's breath caught, and she sank slowly back into her chair, her hands trembling as she absorbed the confirmation of something she had suspected, but had not fully allowed herself to believe. 20 years, she said quietly. "I have carried these fragments of memory my entire life, never understanding what they meant, and now I finally know." "There is more," Cale said, and his tone shifted in a way that made her look up sharply, sensing that whatever came next would not bring the same measure of comfort as learning the truth of her origins. "The debt that brought you here was not the result of simple misfortune. Edmund traced the moneylenders who pursued your family so aggressively back to a source connected to Draven Vane, the alpha responsible for the raid that destroyed my settlement 20 years ago. He is still alive, still ruling the Eastern Territories, and it appears he deliberately engineered your family's financial ruin to ensure you ended up here, in my castle." Alara felt the color drain from her face as the implications settled over her. "My parents failed harvests," she said slowly. "The debt that grew so quickly we could never hope to repay it. All of it was designed, deliberately, by someone I have never even met, for reasons that have nothing to do with my family or our circumstances." "It appears so," Cale confirmed, his voice gentler now than she had ever heard it. "I am sorry, Alara. I know this is a great deal to absorb in a single conversation." "Why?" Alara asked, her voice unsteady. "Why would he do this? What could he possibly want from me, or from you, that would require such an elaborate scheme?" "I do not yet know his full purpose," Cale admitted. "But I suspect he intends to use the connection between us as leverage, should the opportunity arise. Which is why I must ask you to trust me in the days ahead, even when the precautions I take may feel excessive or unwelcome. I will not allow him to use you against me, Alara. I will not fail you the way I believe I failed you 20 years ago." Alara looked up at him, studying the raw determination in his expression, and felt something shift within her own chest, a warmth that had been growing steadily since that first conversation in the moonlit garden, now blooming into something she could no longer pretend was simply gratitude or curiosity. "You did not fail me," she said softly. "You were a child yourself, caught in the middle of a tragedy far beyond your control. Whatever guilt you have carried these 20 years, you do not need to carry it any longer." Cale's expression flickered with something raw and unguarded, an emotion he rarely allowed himself to display, even in private. "I appreciate you saying that," he said quietly, "though I confess it will take more than words to release a burden I have carried for so long." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the evening's revelations settling around them, until Alara finally spoke again, her voice carrying a new resolve that had not been present when the conversation began. "What happens now?" "Now," Cale said, "we prepare. If Draven Vane intends to make some move against either of us, we will not be caught unprepared. I will increase security throughout the castle, and I will begin reaching out to our allies among the northern territories, in case we require additional support, should this situation escalate into open conflict." "And what of me?" Alara asked. "Am I simply meant to remain here, waiting to see what he does next?" Cale's jaw tightened slightly at the question, and Alara could see him weighing his words carefully before responding. "I would prefer you remain within the castle walls, where I can ensure your safety more effectively. I understand this may feel like a continuation of the same confinement you experienced upon your arrival here, and I am sorry for that. But the threat Draven Vane poses is not one I am willing to risk, not when your safety is at stake." Alara considered his words, recognizing the genuine concern behind them even as a small part of her chafed at the idea of further restriction on her movements. "I understand," she said finally, "though I would ask that you keep me informed of whatever developments arise. I have spent my entire life not understanding the forces shaping my circumstances. I do not wish to return to that kind of ignorance now." even if the truth proves difficult to face. "You have my word," Cale said, and something in the solemnity of his promise told her he meant it entirely, that whatever else might be uncertain about their unusual, complicated situation, his commitment to honesty with her, at least, was not something she needed to doubt. As the days passed following that revelation, the atmosphere within Blackthorn Castle grew subtly tense, though most of the staff remained unaware of the specific threat that had prompted the increased security measures now visible throughout the grounds. Additional guards patrolled the walls at all hours. Cale began holding regular meetings with his military advisors, discussing contingencies and defensive preparations that had not been necessary during the long years of uneasy peace with the Eastern Territories. Elara found herself growing closer to Cale during this period of heightened tension, their shared secret and shared danger creating a bond between them that neither could deny, even as both remained careful about how openly they acknowledged it. Their evening conversations in the garden continued, though now they discussed not only the mysteries of Elara's past, but the uncertain future that lay ahead, the looming shadow of Draven Vane's unknown intentions hanging over every plan they attempted to make. It was during one such evening, as autumn began to settle over Blackthorn Kingdom and the nights grew colder, that the first sign of danger finally arrived, in a form neither of them had anticipated. It began with a letter, delivered by an unfamiliar courier, who arrived at the castle gates just after midday, claiming to carry correspondence from a merchant seeking trade agreements with the Northern Territories. The guards, following the increased protocols Cale had established, searched the courier thoroughly and questioned him at length before allowing him entry, but the letter itself appeared harmless enough, filled with the kind of formal, flowery language typical of trade proposals. It was Edmund who noticed the discrepancy, his years of experience reading correspondence for hidden meanings, alerting him to something amiss in the wording, a phrase that seemed oddly specific for a simple trade proposal. He brought it immediately to Cale's attention. "Read this section carefully," Edmund said, pointing to a paragraph near the middle of the letter. "The merchant claims interest in acquiring rare herbs from the Western Hills. Herbs he describes, with unusual specificity, for someone claiming to be unfamiliar with our territory. But this particular herb, the one he names here, silverleaf root, is known primarily for its use in certain sedatives and sleeping draughts. It is an odd detail to include in a formal trade proposal, unless the letter is meant to convey something else entirely." Cale studied the passage carefully, his expression darkening as understanding dawned. "A coded message," he said, "meant for someone within my own castle, someone who might recognize the reference and understand it as a signal. That is my suspicion as well, my lord, though I do not yet know who the intended recipient might be, or what specific action the message is meant to trigger." Cale immediately ordered a thorough investigation of every servant and guard who had joined the castle staff within the past several months, cross-referencing their backgrounds against any possible connection to the Eastern Territories. The investigation took several tense days, during which Cale insisted Elara remain within sight of trusted guards at all times, a precaution she accepted without complaint, sensing the genuine danger that now seemed to be closing in around her. The investigation eventually revealed a troubling discovery. A stable hand named Garrick, who had joined the castle staff only 2 months earlier, shortly before Elara's own arrival, had provided false references that, upon deeper investigation, traced back to a small settlement within Draven Vane's territory. When confronted, Garrick initially denied any wrongdoing, but under the weight of mounting evidence, he eventually confessed to being sent specifically to monitor Elara's movements and report back to his true employer through coded correspondence, disguised as trade communications. He was to wait for further instructions, Garrick admitted, his voice shaking as he stood before Cale in the throne room, flanked by guards who had discovered him attempting to flee the castle grounds the moment he realized his cover had been compromised. "I was told only that the girl's safety was of great interest to my employer, and that I should report any significant changes in her circumstances, particularly regarding her relationship to you, my lord." "And what were you told would happen once you provided this information?" Cale demanded, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made even his own guards shift uneasily. "I do not know, my lord, I swear it. I was simply a messenger, nothing more. I was never told the full purpose behind the instructions I received." Cale studied the trembling man for a long moment, weighing the truth of his claims, before finally ordering him, held in the castle's dungeons, pending further questioning. As the guards led Garrick away, Cale turned to Edmund, his expression grave. "This confirms our worst suspicions," he said quietly. "Draven Vane has been watching Alara since before her arrival, monitoring the situation closely enough to plant an informant within my own castle. He knows about the connection between us, or at minimum suspects it strongly enough to warrant this level of surveillance." "What do you intend to do, my lord?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, his jaw set in the hard, determined line that Edmund had learned to recognize as the expression his king wore when preparing to make a decision he knew would carry significant consequences. "I intend to remove any ambiguity about where Alara stands, and about the protection she now has under my rule," he said finally. "If Draven Vane wishes to use her as leverage against me, he will find that any move against her is a move against my kingdom directly, with all the consequences that entails." That evening, Cale called for a formal gathering of his court, an announcement that sent ripples of curiosity and speculation through every corner of the castle, as servants and nobles alike gathered in the great hall, uncertain what significant news their king intended to share. Alara, informed only that her presence was required, and given no further explanation, found herself standing nervously beside Marta, near the edge of the gathered crowd, watching as Cale took his place at the head of the hall. "I have called you here tonight," Cale began, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "to address matters that concern the security of this kingdom, and the safety of someone who has become important to its future." His gaze found Alara across the crowded room, and though his expression remained composed, something in his eyes softened as their eyes met. "Some among you are aware that a young woman named Alara Whitfield arrived at this castle several weeks ago, sent as payment for a debt owed by her family. What most of you do not know is that Alara's presence here is connected to events from my own childhood, to the raid that destroyed my birth settlement 20 years ago, and to a promise I made and failed to keep on that terrible night." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, and Alara felt every eye in the room turn toward her, her cheeks flushing with the sudden, uncomfortable attention. Recent developments have revealed that Alara's presence in this kingdom was not the result of simple misfortune, but was deliberately engineered by Draven Vane, Alpha of the Eastern Territories, the same man responsible for the destruction of my childhood home. His purpose in doing so remains uncertain, but the danger it represents to Alara's safety, and by extension to the stability of this kingdom, is not something I am willing to leave unaddressed. Cale paused, and Alara found herself holding her breath, uncertain what he intended to say next, though something in his expression told her whatever came would change everything about her circumstances within these walls. "Effective immediately," Cale continued, "Alara Whitfield is no longer a servant of this household, nor is she bound by any debt her family previously owed. She stands under my direct protection as my intended mate, and any threat against her will be treated as a direct act of aggression against this kingdom and against me personally." The hall erupted into a low buzz of astonished whispers, and Alara felt her legs go weak beneath her, the weight of Cale's words settling over her with a force she had not anticipated, despite the growing warmth she had felt developing between them over the past weeks. To claim her publicly as his intended mate was no small gesture, she understood, particularly given the political implications such an announcement would carry throughout the Northern Territories and beyond. Cale crossed the hall toward her, the crowd parting to allow his passage, and when he reached her, he took her hand gently in his gray eyes searching her face for any sign of hesitation or unwillingness. "I should have discussed this with you privately, before making such an announcement," he said quietly, low enough that only she could hear. "But circumstances demanded swift action, and I did not wish to leave any ambiguity that Draven Vane might exploit. If this arrangement is not something you wish to pursue, I will find another way to ensure your protection, but I needed the court and my enemies alike to understand, without question, that you are not a vulnerability to be exploited, but someone under my complete protection." Alara looked up at him, searching his face for the truth behind his words, and found nothing but genuine sincerity in his expression. Whatever political calculations had prompted this public announcement, she could see clearly that his concern for her safety was real, as was the deeper connection that had grown between them over the past weeks of shared secrets and careful, honest conversations. "I do not object," she said softly, and watched something like relief flicker across his features, quickly masked but unmistakable. though I confess, I did not expect to become your intended mate through a public announcement made without any warning." A ghost of a smile touched Kale's lips, the first genuine expression of humor she had seen from him since her arrival at the castle. "I will endeavor to consult you before making similarly significant decisions in the future," he said, and Alara found herself smiling in return, despite the gravity of the circumstances that had prompted his declaration. The gathering dispersed slowly afterward, the court still buzzing with speculation and surprise at the unexpected announcement, though the increased guard presence throughout the castle made clear that whatever celebration might have accompanied such news under different circumstances would need to wait until the more immediate threat had been addressed. Kale spent the remainder of the evening in strategic discussions with his military advisors, preparing for the possibility that Draven Vane might respond to the public announcement with more direct aggression now that his surveillance had been discovered and his intentions, at least partially, exposed. Alara, meanwhile, found herself sitting alone in her new chambers, her mind racing with the implications of everything that had happened. She thought of her family back in Fenwick Hollow, wondering how news of this announcement might reach them, wondering whether Colin, now old enough to understand more of what was happening, would be proud of how far his sister had come, or frightened by the danger that now seemed to surround her. She thought, too, of the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment, from a simple farm girl facing an impossible debt to the intended mate of one of the most powerful rulers in the Northern Territories, all because of a mark on her wrist and memories she had spent her entire life dismissing as nothing more than childhood nightmares. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she opened it to find Kale standing in the corridor, his expression carrying a weariness that spoke of the long, difficult evening he had just endured. "I wanted to make certain you were well," he said simply. "Today has been a great deal to absorb, and I recognize that I placed you in a difficult position by making such an announcement without proper warning." "I am well," Alara assured him, stepping aside to allow him entry into her chambers, though she was suddenly acutely aware of the intimacy of the gesture, of inviting the king of Blackthorn Kingdom into her private quarters so late in the evening. "Though I confess I have many questions about what happens next, both regarding Draven Vane and regarding what it means to be your intended mate, given the circumstances under which the announcement was made." Kale settled into the chair near her small fireplace, and Alara found herself sitting across from him, the fire casting warm light across features that had grown steadily more familiar to her over the past weeks. "I will not pretend the announcement was made purely out of romantic sentiment," he admitted honestly. "Political necessity played a significant role in my decision, but Alara, I want you to understand that the necessity did not create feelings that were not already present. I have found myself drawn to you since that first evening in my mother's garden, in ways I did not fully anticipate, or, if I am honest, entirely welcome, given the complicated circumstances of your arrival here." Alara felt her heart quicken at his admission, and she found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the raw honesty in his expression. "I have felt something similar," she confessed, though I told myself it was simply gratitude, or curiosity, or the natural result of shared secrets and shared danger. I am not certain I fully believed those explanations even as I offered them to myself. A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the crackling warmth of the fire, and the unspoken acknowledgement of feelings neither had been willing to fully articulate until this moment of shared vulnerability. Kale reached across the small distance between their chairs and gently took her hand, his thumb tracing lightly over the crescent-shaped mark on her wrist, the same mark that had started this entire extraordinary journey. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "whatever Draven Vane intends, and whatever danger we may face in the days ahead, I want you to know that my commitment to your safety, and to whatever future we might build together, is genuine. It is not simply born from guilt over a promise I failed to keep 20 years ago, though that guilt certainly played its part in bringing us to this moment. It is born from who you have shown yourself to be during these past weeks, your kindness, your resilience, your quiet strength in the face of circumstances that would have broken many others." Alara felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though for the first time since her arrival at Blackthorn Castle, they were not tears born from fear or grief, but from something far warmer and more hopeful. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me. For remembering, even after all these years, even after everything you have endured since that terrible night." "I could never truly forget," Kale said softly. Some part of me, even during the years I told myself the memory no longer mattered, was always searching for you. Even if I did not fully understand that was what I was doing. They sat together for a long while after that, neither speaking, simply enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's presence after the tumultuous events of the day. But even as the warmth between them deepened, both remained acutely aware that the danger posed by Draven Vane had not diminished simply because Cale had made his intentions publicly known. If anything, the announcement had likely escalated the stakes considerably, transforming Alara from a mere pawn in whatever scheme Draven Vane had originally intended, into something far more significant, a direct challenge to his ambitions that he would not likely allow to stand unanswered. Neither of them could have known, as they sat together beside the warm fire that evening, just how soon and how dramatically that challenge would be answered. News of Cale's announcement spread quickly beyond the castle walls, carried by traveling merchants and messengers to every corner of the northern territories within a matter of days. Reactions varied considerably depending on who received the news. Among the common folk of Blackthorn Kingdom, the story of a servant girl, discovered to be connected to their king's tragic past, captured the imagination in ways that softened, if only slightly, the fearsome reputation Cale had cultivated over years of harsh but effective rule. Among the nobility, however, the reaction proved considerably more complicated. Several prominent families, who had long hoped to secure alliances with the throne through more traditional means, expressed quiet displeasure at the unexpected announcement, though none dared voice their objections openly given Cale's well-known intolerance for challenges to his authority. Alara found herself the subject of careful, appraising glances whenever she moved through the castle's public spaces, the nobility's curiosity mixed with a wariness that made her acutely aware of how precarious her new position truly was. It was Finn, the young guard who had shown her kindness during her earliest days at the castle, who first alerted her to more concerning developments brewing within the court itself. "There's talk," he said quietly one afternoon, finding her alone in the garden where she had taken to spending her free hours since the announcement. "Among some of the older nobles, particularly those with connections to House Thornwood, they're unhappy about the king's choice, and I've heard whispers that some among them may have reached out to parties outside the kingdom who share their displeasure." Alara felt a chill run through her despite the mild autumn afternoon. "You mean they might be communicating with Draven Vane?" Finn glanced around nervously before nodding. "I can't say for certain, but Lord Thornwood has always resented the king's rise to power, given that his own family once held significant influence within the previous ruling structure. He lost a great deal when the king consolidated the northern territories under his direct rule, and I wouldn't put it past him to seek allies wherever he might find them, even allies as dangerous as Draven Vane, if it meant weakening the king's position." "Have you told anyone else about this suspicion?" Alara asked. "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first, since it directly concerns your safety, but I think you should tell the king. He needs to know that the threat may not be coming only from outside the castle walls." That evening, Alara relayed Finn's concerns to Cale, watching his expression harden as he absorbed the implications of a potential internal betrayal layered atop the external threat they were already navigating. He immediately summoned Edmund, and the three of them spent hours discussing how to investigate Lord Thornwood's activities, without alerting him to the fact that his suspected disloyalty had already come to light. "We must proceed carefully," Edmund advised. "If Lord Thornwood suspects we are aware of his potential communications with Draven Vane, he may destroy evidence, or accelerate whatever plans he has already set in motion. I recommend we place him under discreet surveillance, while continuing our broader investigation into Draven Vane's intentions." Cale agreed, though Alara could see the toll this new revelation was taking on him, the exhaustion of navigating threats from multiple directions simultaneously, while also attempting to build something genuine and lasting with her amid the chaos. She found herself wanting to ease his burden in whatever small ways she could, bringing him tea during his late-night strategy sessions, sitting quietly beside him while he worked through correspondence and reports, offering the simple comfort of her presence, even when she had little practical assistance to provide. Their relationship, despite the mounting external pressures, continued to deepen during this period. Cale made a point of setting aside time each evening, however briefly, to simply be with her, without the weight of politics and danger pressing upon every conversation. They walked together through the castle's private garden, discussing everything from her childhood memories of Fenwick Hollow to his own complicated relationship with the responsibilities of ruling a kingdom he had never expected to inherit. She learned that beneath his controlled, commanding exterior lay a man who genuinely cared for the well-being of his people, who agonized over decisions that affected even the smallest households within his territory, who carried the weight of every life lost during his difficult rise to power, with a heaviness he rarely allowed others to see. "You do not have to carry all of this alone," Elara told him one evening, as they sat together beside the fountain, the autumn air growing crisp around them. "Whatever burdens you carry, whatever guilt or responsibility weighs on you, you no longer have to face it in isolation." Cale studied her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering across his usually composed features. "I have carried these burdens alone for so long. I confess I hardly know how to do otherwise," he admitted. "But I find that having you beside me makes the weight considerably more bearable, even when the circumstances surrounding us grow more dangerous by the day." Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the castle staff, many of whom had grown genuinely fond of Elara during her weeks working alongside them in the kitchens and library. Bridget, in particular, seemed to take quiet satisfaction in the transformation she observed in her king, remarking to Marta one evening that she had not seen Cale Ashgrave smile so often, nor so genuinely, in all her years of service to the throne. But even as the bond between Cale and Elara deepened, the investigation into Lord Thornwood's activities yielded increasingly troubling results. Edmund's discreet surveillance revealed a pattern of correspondence between Thornwood and an unknown party, using coded language, similar to the trade letter that had initially exposed Garrick's presence within the castle. Though the messages remained frustratingly vague about specific plans, the frequency and secrecy of the communications left little doubt that Lord Thornwood had indeed established contact with someone connected to Draven Vane's court. "We need more concrete evidence before we can act openly against him," Edmund advised during a tense meeting in Cale's study, Elara seated quietly nearby, having become a regular presence in these strategic discussions, given her direct stake in their outcome. "Lord Thornwood commands considerable loyalty among certain factions within the nobility. Acting against him without irrefutable proof of his betrayal could fracture the stability of your rule, precisely the outcome Draven Vane likely hopes to achieve." "Then we must find that proof," Cale said, his frustration evident despite his controlled tone. "I will not allow this threat to continue growing unchecked while we wait for perfect certainty." It was Elara who eventually suggested an approach that the others had not yet considered. "What if we allow Lord Thornwood to believe his communications remain undetected, but subtly control the information he receives? If we can influence what he reports to Draven Vane, we might be able to anticipate their next move, or even use the false information to our advantage." Cale considered her suggestion carefully, and Edmund nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the strategic thinking behind her proposal. "It is a sound idea," Edmund said, "though it will require careful execution. We would need someone within Thornwood's household who could subtly influence the content of his correspondence without raising suspicion." "Finn," Elara suggested. "He has already shown himself willing to help, and his position among the guards would allow him plausible reasons to interact with members of Thornwood's household without arousing undue attention." Cale agreed to the plan, and over the following days, Finn worked carefully to establish subtle connections within Lord Thornwood's household, gathering information while ensuring that whatever details eventually reached Draven Vane through Thornwood's correspondence would be carefully curated to serve Cale's strategic interests, rather than genuinely compromise his position. This period of careful maneuvering, however, could not last indefinitely. Nearly 2 weeks after Cale's public announcement, Finn arrived at the castle late one evening, his expression grave, carrying news that would force their careful strategy of patient observation to give way to immediate, decisive action. "Lord Thornwood received a message today," Finn reported, his voice tight with urgency, as he stood before Cale and Elara in the private study. "I was able to glimpse only fragments of it before it was destroyed, but the language was unmistakable. Draven Vane intends to make a move, and soon." The message referenced an upcoming diplomatic gathering, a peace conference between Blackthorn Kingdom and several neighboring territories that has been planned for weeks. It seems Draven Vane intends to use the gathering as cover for some kind of direct action against Elara. Cale's expression darkened immediately, his hand instinctively moving to rest protectively near Alara, who felt her stomach tighten with dread at the confirmation that the danger they had been anticipating was no longer a distant, theoretical threat, but an imminent reality. "The peace conference is scheduled for 3 days from now," Cale said, his mind already racing through the strategic implications. "It will draw nobility and representatives from across the northern and eastern territories, providing ample cover for anyone wishing to conceal their true intentions among the larger gathering. If Draven Vane plans to strike during the conference, he will have numerous opportunities to do so without immediately revealing his involvement." "Should we cancel the gathering?" Alara asked, though even as she spoke the words, she sensed the answer would not be so simple. Canceling would raise immediate suspicion, and could be perceived as weakness by the other territories who have already committed to attending, Edmund said, having joined them upon hearing the urgent news. "It might also alert Draven Vane that we have discovered his plans, causing him to accelerate whatever alternative scheme he might have prepared." "Then we must proceed with the conference as planned," Cale said, his jaw set with grim determination, but with security measures far exceeding what would typically be considered necessary for such a gathering. "I want every guard on high alert. I want Alara's movements carefully monitored at all times, without making the precautions so obvious that they alert Draven Vane's agents to our awareness of his plans." Alara felt fear coiling tightly in her chest at the prospect of the coming conference, knowing that whatever danger Draven Vane intended to unleash would likely target her directly, given everything they had learned about his motivations. But beneath the fear, she also felt a growing resolve, a determination not to allow herself to become merely a passive victim in whatever scheme was unfolding around her. "I want to help," she said, drawing surprised glances from both Cale and Edmund. "I understand the danger, but I refuse to simply hide away while everyone else works to protect me. If there is any way I can contribute to keeping myself, and this kingdom, safe from whatever Draven Vane intends, I want to be part of that effort." Cale studied her for a long moment, and Alara could see the internal conflict playing across his features, his protective instincts warring with his growing respect for her courage and capability. Finally, he nodded slowly. "We will find a role for you in our preparations," he said, "though I will not compromise your safety for the sake of strategic convenience. Whatever part you play, it will be carefully considered and closely protected." As the castle began its urgent preparations for the coming conference, an undercurrent of tension permeated every corridor, every conversation, every carefully guarded glance exchanged between those aware of the true danger lurking beneath the diplomatic gathering's peaceful facade. Alara found herself training alongside a small group of trusted guards in basic self-defense techniques, determined not to be caught entirely helpless should the confrontation with Draven Vane's agents become unavoidable. And through it all, the bond between Alara and Cale continued to strengthen, forged now not only through shared secrets and growing affection, but through the shared understanding that whatever came during the peace conference, they would face it together, prepared as thoroughly as circumstances allowed, refusing to let fear dictate their actions or diminish the connection that had grown between them against all reasonable expectation. 3 days remained until the conference, and within Blackthorn Castle, every moment of that time felt charged with an anticipation that bordered on dread, as everyone involved understood, without needing to speak the fear aloud, that the coming gathering would likely determine not only Alara's fate, but the future of the fragile peace between Blackthorn Kingdom and the eastern territories that had held, uneasily, for 20 long years. The day of the peace conference arrived beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds, a fitting backdrop, Alara thought, for the tension that had settled over Blackthorn Castle in the days leading up to the gathering. Delegations from across the northern territories had begun arriving the previous evening, their colorful banners and elaborate carriages filling the castle's outer courtyard, with a display of pageantry that felt strangely at odds with the quiet dread simmering beneath the surface of every preparation. Alara stood at her window that morning, watching the steady stream of arrivals, searching each unfamiliar face for any sign of the danger she knew was likely hidden somewhere among them. She wore a gown of deep blue, chosen carefully by Marta to convey the dignity befitting her new position as the king's intended mate, though the fine fabric did little to ease the anxious knot that had settled in her stomach since Finn's warning 3 days earlier. A soft knock at her door announced Cale's arrival, and she turned to find him dressed formally as well, his usual dark, practical attire replaced by robes befitting his royal station, though she could see the tension coiled beneath his composed exterior, visible in the tightness around his eyes, and the careful, measured way he moved, like a man preparing for battle rather than diplomacy. "The Eastern delegation has arrived," he said without preamble, his voice low and controlled. "Draven Vane sent a representative rather than attending personally, an advisor named Corvin, who has served him for many years. Edmund believes he may be the one coordinating whatever plan Draven Vane has set in motion." "Do we know what form the danger will take?" Ilara asked, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling tighter within her. "Not with certainty," Cale admitted, "but I have arranged for you to remain close to me throughout the day's proceedings, surrounded by guards I trust absolutely. Whatever Corvin and his associates intend, they will find no easy opportunity to act against you." The formal proceedings began shortly after midday, the Great Hall transformed for the occasion. With long tables arranged for the various delegations, formal banners hung from the high ceiling, and an elaborate display of hospitality that belied the careful vigilance every member of Cale's household maintained throughout the gathering. Ilara sat near Cale's side during the opening ceremonies, her attention divided between the formal diplomatic proceedings and the constant, careful observation of every face within the crowded hall, searching for any sign of the threat they had been warned to expect. Corvin, the Eastern delegate, proved to be a smooth, careful speaker, his diplomatic language polished, and his manner outwardly cordial, as he extended formal greetings on behalf of Draven Vane's territory. But Ilara noticed the way his gaze occasionally drifted toward her during his address, a calculating assessment that made her skin prickle with unease, despite his otherwise unremarkable demeanor. The afternoon proceeded through a series of formal discussions regarding trade agreements and territorial boundaries, the kind of tedious diplomatic negotiations that Ilara found difficult to focus on, given the undercurrent of danger she knew lurked somewhere beneath the surface of the gathering. She found herself grateful when the formal session finally concluded, and the assembled delegates moved toward the castle's great banquet hall for the evening's festivities, though the shift to a more informal setting brought its own particular anxieties, given the greater freedom of movement it would allow anyone seeking an opportunity to act against her. It was during the banquet, as the evening wore on, and the formal atmosphere gradually relaxed into something more convivial, that Finn approached Cale with an urgent, quietly delivered message. "My lord," he said, his voice barely audible above the surrounding conversation, "Lord Thornwood has left the main hall, claiming a need for fresh air. But I observed him moving toward the eastern wing rather than the gardens, and Corvin departed shortly after him, in the same direction." Cale's expression sharpened immediately, though he maintained his outward composure for the benefit of the surrounding guests. "Stay close to Ilara," he instructed Finn quietly. "I need to investigate this myself." Quietly, without alerting the wider gathering to any concern. "I want to come with you," Ilara said immediately, though Cale shook his head firmly. "It is safer for you to remain here, surrounded by trusted guards, and the visibility of the crowded hall. If this is the moment Draven Vane's agents have been waiting for, I do not wish to lead you directly into whatever danger Thornwood and Corvin may be planning." Ilara wanted to argue, every instinct urging her to remain close to Cale, rather than be separated during such a precarious moment, but she recognized the wisdom in his caution, and reluctantly agreed to remain within the hall, Finn positioned protectively at her side, as Cale slipped quietly away, accompanied by two of his most trusted guards. The minutes that followed felt agonizingly long to Ilara, her attention no longer even attempting to focus on the surrounding festivities, as she watched the doorway through which Cale had departed, waiting anxiously for any sign of his return. Finn remained tense and alert beside her, his hand never straying far from the hilt of his sword, his eyes constantly scanning the crowded hall for any sign of unusual movement or suspicious behavior among the gathered nobility. It was nearly 20 minutes later when a commotion arose near the hall's main entrance, guards moving with sudden urgency, their formal composure abandoned in favor of alert, purposeful action. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat as she caught sight of Cale returning, his expression grim, flanked by his guards who now held Lord Thornwood between them, the older nobleman's face pale and defiant despite his obvious capture. But it was the absence of Corvin among the returning group that sent a fresh wave of dread through Ilara, a sense that whatever confrontation had occurred, it had not resolved as neatly as she might have hoped. Cale made his way directly toward her, his expression carrying an intensity that made her stomach twist with fresh anxiety. "Corvin fled when we discovered them," he said quietly, close enough that only she and Finn could hear his words over the surrounding murmur of confused, curious onlookers who had noticed the sudden disturbance. "Thornwood has confessed to conspiring with him, providing information about castle security in exchange for promises of restored influence once Draven Vane's plan succeeded. But Corvin was not acting alone. Thornwood indicated that others have already gained access to the castle grounds under the cover of the conference, disguised among the various delegations." "Others?" Ilara repeated, fear tightening around her chest. "How many?" "We do not yet know," Kale admitted, "but we must assume the danger is more immediate than we anticipated. I want you moved to a secure location immediately, away from the main gathering, until we can determine the full scope of the threat." Even as Kale spoke, a sudden disturbance erupted near the hall's western entrance, screams and shouts cutting through the previously festive atmosphere, as several figures, dressed in the livery of visiting delegations, but moving with the coordinated purpose of trained fighters, rather than diplomatic attendants, surged into the hall, scattering panicked guests in their wake. "Now," Kale shouted, grabbing Ilara's arm and pulling her behind him, as chaos erupted around them, guards rushing to intercept the attackers, while terrified nobility scrambled toward the hall's exits. Finn moved immediately to Ilara's other side, his sword drawn, positioning himself as an additional barrier between her and the unfolding danger. The attackers, Ilara realized with mounting horror, were moving with clear purpose, directly toward where she and Kale stood, cutting through the panicked crowd with a ruthless efficiency that spoke of careful planning and considerable skill. Kale's own guards intercepted the first wave, a brief, intense clash of steel ringing through the hall as the castle's defenders fought to hold back the assault. "We need to get you out of here," Kale said urgently, already pulling her toward a side passage that led away from the main hall, Finn covering their retreat as they moved. "There is a secure passage that leads to the castle's inner keep. If we can reach it, you will be protected behind walls these attackers cannot easily breach." They moved quickly through the chaotic hall, the sounds of fighting and panicked shouting fading slightly as they reached the relative quiet of the side passage Kale had indicated. But their relief proved short-lived. As they rounded a corner deeper into the passage, 3 more attackers emerged from a side chamber, clearly having anticipated exactly this route of escape. Kale reacted instantly, positioning himself between Ilara and the newly revealed threat, his own weapon drawn with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years perfecting his combat skills. "Finn, get her to the inner keep," he ordered sharply. "I will hold them here." "I am not leaving you," Ilara said fiercely, even as fear coursed through her at the sight of the armed attackers advancing toward them. "Ilara, please," Kale said, his voice carrying an urgency that cut through his usual controlled composure. "I cannot fight effectively while worrying for your safety in the same breath. Trust me. Go with Finn." The desperate plea in his voice, so unlike his usual commanding tone, finally convinced her, and she allowed Finn to pull her back down the passage, even as Kale turned to face the approaching attackers alone. She heard the clash of steel begin behind her as Finn hurried her along, her heart pounding with terror not only for her own safety but for Kale's, left behind to face 3 armed opponents without the support of his guards. They had nearly reached the entrance to the inner keep when a 4th figure emerged directly in their path, blocking the narrow passage entirely. Ilara recognized him immediately as Corvin, the Eastern delegate who had fled the earlier confrontation with Thornwood, his diplomatic composure now entirely abandoned in favor of a cold, calculating expression that sent fresh terror coursing through her. "There you are," Corvin said, his voice carrying none of the polished courtesy he had displayed during the formal proceedings. "Draven Vane will be most pleased to finally have you in his possession, after all these years of careful waiting." Finn moved immediately to intercept him, positioning himself protectively between Corvin and Ilara, but the Eastern delegate proved far more skilled in combat than his diplomatic bearing had suggested, deflecting Finn's initial strike with practiced ease, before countering with a swift, brutal blow that sent the young guard staggering backward. "Finn!" Ilara cried out, watching in horror as he struggled to regain his footing, blood already visible along his temple from where Corvin's strike had connected. "You should not have come this way," Corvin said, advancing steadily toward Ilara, despite Finn's determined attempts to intercept him again. But it matters little now. Draven Vane has waited 20 years for this moment. I do not intend to fail him at the final step. Elara backed away instinctively, her mind racing for any option that might allow her to escape or defend herself, when a sudden, powerful presence surged past her, and she realized Cale had somehow disposed of his own attackers and arrived just in time to intercept Corvin's advance. "You will not touch her," Cale said, his voice carrying a lethal calm that Elara had never heard from him before, a controlled fury that spoke of exactly how dangerous the man before her truly was, when pushed to his absolute limits. Corvin's confident expression flickered with genuine alarm at Cale's sudden arrival, clearly having not anticipated that the king would dispatch his other attackers quickly enough to intervene personally. But he recovered quickly, raising his weapon defensively as Cale advanced with deadly purpose. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense, Cale's superior skill and the desperate fury of a man defending everything he had come to care for, overwhelming Corvin's calculated composure within moments. Elara watched, breathless with fear and hope in equal measure, as Cale finally disarmed his opponent, pressing his own weapon firmly against Corvin's throat. "Tell me exactly what Draven Vane intended," Cale demanded, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for defiance. "Tell me now, or you will not survive this night to report your failure back to him." Corvin's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of Cale's fury, and the very real threat evident in his expression. "He wanted her," Corvin said, his voice shaking, "not merely as leverage against you, but as something more personal. He believed if he could take her, could use her as he intended, it would prove finally that his power exceeds your own, that even the connection you share with your past cannot be protected from his reach." "And what did he intend to do with her, once he had her in his possession?" Cale demanded. Corvin hesitated, and Cale's grip tightened warningly. "He intended to keep her," Corvin finally admitted, "as a symbol of his victory over you, and eventually, perhaps, to use her as a means of forcing concessions from your kingdom that he could never have achieved through open conflict." Cale's expression darkened further at this confirmation of Draven Vane's intentions, and for a moment, Elara feared he might act on the lethal fury visible in his eyes, but he restrained himself, instead ordering the guards who had finally arrived to secure Corvin for formal questioning and eventual judgment. As the immediate danger passed and the castle's forces began the difficult work of restoring order to the chaotic aftermath of the attack, Cale finally turned his full attention to Elara, his composed exterior cracking, to reveal the raw fear and relief that he had been suppressing throughout the confrontation. "Are you injured?" he asked urgently, his hands moving to check her for any wounds she might have sustained during the chaos. "I am unharmed," Elara assured him, though her voice trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. But Finn, he was struck during the confrontation with Corvin. They found Finn nearby, being tended by castle healers who had arrived to address the various injuries sustained during the attack. Though his wound proved less severe than initially feared, the sight of his blood-streaked face served as a sobering reminder of how close the evening had come to ending in true tragedy. As the castle slowly began recovering from the chaos of the failed assault, Cale pulled Elara into a tight embrace, the formal composure he typically maintained entirely abandoned in the wake of the danger they had just survived together. "I nearly lost you tonight," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I do not know what I would have done had Corvin succeeded in taking you." Elara held him tightly in return, finally allowing her own carefully maintained composure to crack, as the full weight of the evening's danger settled over her. "We survived," she said softly. "Together, just as we said we would." But even as relief washed over them both, they understood that this confrontation, however dramatic and dangerous, represented only the opening move in whatever larger conflict Draven Vane intended to wage against them. The Eastern Alpha's ambitions had been exposed and thwarted this night, but a man who had waited 20 years to reclaim what he believed belonged to him would not likely abandon his purpose simply because his first attempt had failed. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, in the eastern territories that had produced such careful, calculated danger, Draven Vane was undoubtedly already planning his next move, and both Cale and Elara understood, without needing to speak the fear aloud, that the true conflict between them had only just begun. In the days following the attack, Blackthorn Castle settled into a tense but purposeful rhythm, as Cale worked to address both the immediate aftermath of the failed assault and the larger threat that Draven Vane's actions had now made undeniable. Lord Thornwood, stripped of his titles and holdings, awaited formal judgment for his betrayal, while Corvin remained imprisoned within the castle's dungeons, providing what limited additional information he possessed about Draven Vane's broader intentions under careful, persistent questioning. The other northern territories, having witnessed firsthand the chaos and danger that had erupted during what was meant to be a peaceful diplomatic gathering, responded with a mixture of alarm and solidarity. Several neighboring rulers sent formal messages condemning Draven Vane's actions and pledging support should Blackthorn Kingdom require assistance in addressing the growing threat from the eastern territories. Cale found himself, for the first time in years, actively building alliances rather than simply maintaining the wary independence that had characterized his rule since taking the throne. Alara, meanwhile, struggled to process the aftermath of the attack, the reality of how close she had come to being taken settling over her with a weight that made sleep difficult in the nights that followed. She found herself grateful for Cale's constant presence during this period, his own composure clearly shaken by how narrowly they had avoided disaster, leading him to abandon much of the careful distance he had maintained, even during the early weeks of their growing closeness. "I keep thinking of what might have happened," she admitted to him one evening, as they sat together in his private study, the fire casting warm light across features still marked by the strain of recent events. "If Finn had not intercepted Corvin when he did, if you had arrived even a few moments later." "I understand," Cale said quietly, reaching for her hand. "I have found myself replaying those moments as well, imagining outcomes I do not wish to consider. But we survived, Alara. We faced the danger together and we survived it. That must count for something, even as we prepare for whatever comes next." Their relationship, tempered by shared danger and the raw honesty that crisis often reveals, had deepened considerably in the aftermath of the attack. Cale no longer hesitated to express the depth of his feelings for her, and Alara found herself increasingly certain that whatever complicated circumstances had originally brought them together, the connection they now shared was genuine and lasting, born of mutual respect and understanding rather than mere obligation or political convenience. But even as their personal bond strengthened, the political situation surrounding them grew increasingly precarious. Edmund's careful investigation into the full scope of Draven Vane's network within Blackthorn Kingdom revealed additional concerning connections, servants and minor nobles who had been quietly compromised over the years, providing information to the eastern territories in exchange for various promises or payments. Rooting out this network proved a delicate, time-consuming process, one that Cale insisted on handling personally to ensure no additional threats remained hidden within his own household. "How extensive is the network?" Alara asked one afternoon, as she reviewed some of the findings alongside Cale and Edmund in the private study that had become the center of their ongoing strategic planning. "More extensive than I would have liked to discover," Edmund admitted grimly. "It appears Draven Vane has been cultivating informants within Blackthorn Kingdom for many years, likely since shortly after the king took the throne. Whether this was always in preparation for the possibility of locating you, or whether his interests have simply expanded over time to include broader intelligence gathering, remains unclear." "Either way," Cale said, his expression hardening, "it confirms that Draven Vane views this kingdom as unfinished business, a territory he still believes rightfully belongs under his influence, regardless of the 20 years that have passed since his original attempt to claim it, through the raid on my birth settlement." The investigation continued over the following weeks, gradually identifying and addressing the network of informants that had operated within Blackthorn Kingdom for so long undetected. Several individuals were quietly removed from positions of trust, their activities carefully documented for potential future use, should formal charges against Draven Vane ever become necessary. Others, upon confrontation with the evidence against them, provided additional valuable information about the Eastern Alpha's broader ambitions and methods. It was during this period of careful, methodical investigation that Alara found herself growing into a role she had never anticipated occupying, working alongside Cale and his advisors, not merely as an object of protection, but as an active participant in the strategic decisions shaping the kingdom's response to the growing threat. Her insights, drawn from a perspective outside the traditional political structures Cale and Edmund had operated within for years, often proved valuable in ways that surprised even Cale himself. "You have a talent for seeing patterns others miss," he told her one evening, after she had identified a connection between two seemingly unrelated pieces of information that had eluded even Edmund's careful analysis. "I confess, I did not anticipate finding such a capable strategic mind, alongside everything else I have come to value in you." Alara felt a warm flush of pride at his praise, though she tried to deflect the compliment with characteristic modesty. "I simply spent many years learning to notice small details that others might overlook," she said. "It was often necessary, growing up in circumstances where every resource had to be carefully managed, and every risk carefully weighed." "Whatever the source of your skill," Cale said, "I am grateful for it, and grateful that you have chosen to apply it toward our shared circumstances, rather than simply enduring them as a passive bystander." As autumn deepened into the early weeks of winter, the investigation into Draven Vane's network within Blackthorn Kingdom gradually wound down, having identified and addressed the most significant threats without triggering the kind of dramatic confrontation that might have alerted the Eastern Alpha to the full extent of his exposure. But the underlying conflict between the two territories remained unresolved, a tension that both Cale and his advisors understood could not continue indefinitely without eventually erupting into more direct confrontation. "He will not simply accept this defeat and withdraw his ambitions," Edmund cautioned during one of their regular strategic discussions. "Draven Vane has invested considerable resources and years of patient planning into his pursuit of Alara and, by extension, his broader ambitions toward Blackthorn Kingdom. The failure of his attempt during the peace conference will likely only accelerate his timeline for more direct action, now that subtlety has proven unsuccessful." "What form might that direct action take?" Alara asked, unable to suppress the anxiety that still lingered whenever the conversation turned toward Draven Vane's likely next moves. "Open conflict," Cale said grimly. "If he cannot achieve his goals through infiltration and manipulation, he may simply attempt to take what he wants through military force, calculating that the element of surprise and his own considerable resources might overcome whatever defensive advantages our territory possesses." This grim assessment prompted a renewed focus on Blackthorn Kingdom's military preparedness, with Cale personally overseeing an intensification of training among his forces and careful review of the kingdom's defensive capabilities along the border shared with the Eastern Territories. Alara found herself drawn into these preparations as well, insisting on learning more substantial combat skills beyond the basic self-defense techniques she had begun practicing before the peace conference. "I refuse to remain helpless should Draven Vane attempt more direct action," she told Cale firmly, when he initially expressed hesitation about her desire for more intensive training. "I understand your instinct to protect me, but I would rather be capable of defending myself and contributing meaningfully to our defense than remain a liability that requires constant protection." Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his protective instincts and his growing respect for her determination and capability. "Very well," he said finally. "I will arrange for proper training, though I insist on personally overseeing at least some of your instruction, given the stakes involved, should you ever need to apply these skills in genuine danger." The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to Alara's days, mornings spent in rigorous training alongside Cale and select members of his guard, afternoons devoted to strategic planning and continued investigation into Draven Vane's broader network and intentions, evenings reserved, whenever circumstances allowed, for the quiet, personal connection that continued to deepen between them, despite the looming shadow of conflict that colored every aspect of their preparations. It was during one such training session, as winter's first snow began falling across the castle grounds, that a messenger arrived bearing news that confirmed everyone's worst fears about Draven Vane's likely response to his failed attempt during the peace conference. The Eastern Alpha had begun mobilizing his forces along the border, a clear and unmistakable signal that whatever patience he had once possessed had finally been exhausted, and that the uneasy peace that had held between the two territories for 20 years was rapidly approaching its end. The news of Draven Vane's mobilization sent Blackthorn Castle into a state of urgent, purposeful preparation, unlike anything Alara had witnessed since her arrival. Cale called an immediate council of his military advisors, and the private study that had once served as the quiet setting for their strategic discussions and growing personal connection now became the center of intense planning for a conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. "How many forces has he mobilized?" Kale demanded of the messenger who had brought word of the Eastern Alpha's movements, a scout who had been monitoring the border regions for exactly this kind of development. "Difficult to say with certainty, my lord," the scout reported, still catching his breath from the hard ride to deliver his news. "But the encampments visible from the border suggest a force considerably larger than would be necessary for simple defensive purposes. Several thousand fighters, at minimum, gathering at 3 separate points along the border." Kale's expression grew grim as he absorbed this information, immediately turning to Edmund and his other advisors to begin formulating a response. "We must reach out to our allies among the northern territories immediately," he said. "The support pledged after the peace conference attack must now be called upon in earnest, if we are to have any hope of matching the force Draven Vane appears prepared to bring against us." Over the following days, messengers were dispatched to every allied territory, urgent requests for military support, carrying the weight of a conflict that threatened to reshape the balance of power throughout the northern and eastern regions. Response came steadily, though not as quickly or comprehensively as Kale might have hoped. Several territories hesitant to fully commit their own forces to a conflict whose ultimate outcome remained uncertain. Alara found herself increasingly involved in these diplomatic efforts, her perspective as someone who had experienced Draven Vane's methods directly proving valuable in convincing wavering allies of the genuine threat his ambitions posed. She accompanied Kale on several tense negotiations with neighboring rulers, her first-hand account of the peace conference attack, and the broader network of manipulation Draven Vane had constructed, helping to overcome the hesitation of allies who might otherwise have remained on the sidelines of the coming conflict. "Your testimony carries weight that mere strategic reports cannot match," Kale told her, after one particularly successful negotiation had secured additional military support from a previously reluctant neighboring territory. "You have a gift for conveying both the genuine danger we face and the personal cost of allowing Draven Vane's ambitions to continue unchecked." As winter deepened and the mobilization along the border continued to grow more concerning, Kale made the difficult decision to move his own forces into defensive positions, preparing for the possibility that Draven Vane might attempt to strike before the coldest months made large-scale military action impractical. Alara insisted on accompanying the forces to the border encampments, despite Kale's initial reluctance to expose her directly to the dangers of the approaching conflict. "I have trained for this," she reminded him firmly, as they discussed her role in the coming weeks. "I refuse to remain safely within the castle walls, while everyone else I care about faces genuine danger on my behalf. If Draven Vane's ambitions center specifically on obtaining me, my presence at the border, protected but visible, might even serve a strategic purpose in drawing his attention and forces toward a location where we have prepared adequate defenses." Kale considered her argument carefully, recognizing both the validity of her strategic reasoning and the depth of her determination not to be sidelined during a conflict that had, in many ways, originated from circumstances connected directly to her own history. "I will agree," he said finally, "on the condition that you remain under the direct protection of guards I trust absolutely, and that you follow my instructions without hesitation, should the situation require immediate action." Alara agreed to these conditions, and within days, found herself situated at the border encampment that would serve as the primary staging ground for Blackthorn Kingdom's defensive forces. The atmosphere at the encampment carried a tension unlike anything she had experienced within the relative safety of the castle. The constant awareness of the massed forces gathering just beyond the border, creating an undercurrent of anxious anticipation that permeated every aspect of daily life among the soldiers and support staff. It was nearly 2 weeks into this tense standoff that Draven Vane finally made his intentions unmistakably clear, sending a formal message to Kale's encampment that demanded, in language stripped of any diplomatic pretense, the immediate surrender of Alara in exchange for the withdrawal of his forces and the preservation of peace between the two territories. "He believes we will simply hand you over to avoid conflict," Kale said, his fury evident as he read the message aloud to his assembled advisors, Alara standing beside him, her own anger at the presumption evident in her tightened expression. "He fundamentally misunderstands both my commitment to your safety and the strength of the alliance we have built in response to his aggression." The formal rejection of Draven Vane's demand, delivered through Kale's own messenger within hours of receiving the ultimatum, made clear that Blackthorn Kingdom would not capitulate to threats, regardless of the military force massed against them. This response, as Edmund had predicted, prompted immediate escalation, and within 2 days, scouts reported that Draven Vane's forces had begun advancing toward the border, in what could only be interpreted as preparation for direct military engagement. The following days passed in a blur of urgent preparation, as Cale's forces, bolstered by the allied contingents that had finally arrived from neighboring territories, established defensive positions along the most likely routes of attack. Alara found herself drawn increasingly into the practical work of supporting these preparations, her earlier combat training now supplemented by more direct involvement in coordinating supplies and communications among the various allied forces. The battle, when it finally came, erupted with a suddenness that caught even the most experienced of Cale's military advisors somewhat off guard. Draven Vane's forces launching a coordinated assault across multiple points along the border simultaneously, clearly designed to overwhelm the defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers rather than tactical sophistication. Alara, stationed at the main command position alongside Cale and his senior advisors, watched with a mixture of terror and determination as the initial waves of conflict unfolded across the snow-covered battlefield below their vantage point. The sounds of combat, the clash of weapons and the cries of wounded fighters, carried up to their position with a visceral immediacy that made the strategic discussions of previous weeks feel suddenly, terribly real. Their eastern flank is pressing harder than anticipated, Edmund reported urgently, studying the unfolding battle with the practiced eye of a veteran commander. If they break through there, they will have a clear path toward this command position. Cale's expression hardened with the weight of command decisions that could determine the outcome of the entire engagement. Redirect the northern reserves to reinforce that flank immediately, he ordered. We cannot allow them to establish that breakthrough. The battle raged for hours, ebbing and flowing across the contested ground, as both sides committed increasing resources to the engagement. Alara found herself pressed into service coordinating messages between different sections of the defensive line, her earlier training in strategic thinking proving valuable as she helped process the constant stream of information flowing into the command position and translate it into actionable updates for Cale and his advisors. It was during the battle's most critical phase, as Draven Vane's forces launched a concentrated assault directly toward the command position itself, clearly having identified it as a priority target, that Alara found herself facing combat far more direct and immediate than anything her training had fully prepared her for. A small group of enemy fighters, having broken through the outer defensive perimeter, surged toward the command position, with clear intent to reach Cale, and, by extension, Alara herself. The guards stationed to protect the command area moved immediately to intercept the threat, but the ferocity of the assault made clear that this was no ordinary skirmish, but a deliberate, targeted attempt to end the conflict through the elimination or capture of Blackthorn Kingdom's leadership. Cale moved immediately to position himself protectively before Alara, his weapon drawn, his earlier composed strategic demeanor giving way to the fierce, decisive combat prowess that had made him one of the most formidable fighters among the northern territories even before he had claimed his throne. Alara, though initially frozen with fear at the sudden direct danger, forced herself to draw the weapon she had trained with over the previous weeks, positioning herself to defend the command position alongside the remaining guards, rather than simply cowering behind Cale's protection. The confrontation that followed was brutal and chaotic, the desperate intensity of fighters who understood that the outcome of this particular clash might determine the fate of the entire battle, lending a ferocious energy to every exchange of blows. Alara found herself engaged directly with an enemy fighter who had broken through the initial line of defense, her training proving just barely sufficient to deflect his initial strikes, while she searched desperately for an opening that might allow her to gain the advantage. It was Cale, having dispatched his own immediate opponents, who finally intervened, striking down the fighter Alara had been struggling against with a swift, decisive blow that ended the immediate threat to her safety. But even as this particular danger passed, the broader battle continued to rage around them, the outcome still very much uncertain, as both sides committed their remaining reserves to the increasingly desperate engagement. It was in the midst of this chaos that Draven Vane himself finally appeared, having apparently decided that his personal intervention was required to salvage what was rapidly becoming a failing military campaign. Alara recognized him immediately from descriptions provided by Edmund and others familiar with the Eastern Alpha's appearance. A tall, imposing figure whose cold, calculating expression bore an unmistakable resemblance to the ruthless ambition that had shaped so much of the tragedy underlying her own history. "Ashgrave," Draven Vane called out, his voice carrying clearly across the chaos of the battlefield as he advanced directly toward the command position, apparently unconcerned by the significant risk such direct exposure represented. "It seems your defenses have proven more capable than I anticipated. But this conflict need not continue further. Surrender the girl, and I will withdraw my remaining forces, sparing further loss of life on both sides." Cale stepped forward to meet this challenge directly, positioning himself between Draven Vane and Alara, with an unmistakable finality that left no room for negotiation. "You have made this same demand before, and received the same answer," he said, his voice carrying a cold fury that Alara had never witnessed from him even during the tense strategic discussions of previous weeks. "Alara will never be yours, Draven Vane. Whatever twisted purpose drove you to destroy my family and pursue her for 20 years, it ends here, today." Draven Vane's expression flickered with something that might have been genuine surprise at the depth of resolve evident in Cale's declaration, though he quickly masked it with his characteristic cold composure. "Then it seems we have no further need for words," he said, drawing his own weapon with the deliberate calm of a fighter supremely confident in his own capabilities. "Let us settle this matter directly, as it perhaps should have been settled 20 years ago." The confrontation between the two leaders drew the attention of fighters on both sides, the broader battle gradually slowing as word spread of the direct confrontation unfolding between Blackthorn Kingdom's king and the Eastern Alpha whose ambitions had driven this entire conflict. Alara watched with terrified fascination as Cale and Draven Vane circled each other warily, each searching for any advantage in what promised to be a decisive, potentially fatal exchange. The fight that followed tested every ounce of skill and determination both combatants possessed. Draven Vane's considerable experience and raw power matched against Cale's own formidable abilities, honed through years of difficult struggle to claim and maintain his throne against constant challenges to his authority. Alara found herself unable to look away, her heart pounding with terror at every exchanged blow, every near miss that might have ended the confrontation in Draven Vane's favor rather than Cale's. The turning point came when Draven Vane, in a moment of overconfident aggression, left himself briefly exposed in his eagerness to press what he believed was a decisive advantage. Cale seized the opportunity with the same decisive precision he applied to every strategic decision, delivering a strike that finally brought the Eastern Alpha to his knees, his weapon knocked from his grasp, his position of dominance shattered in a single, crucial moment. "Yield," Cale demanded, his weapon poised at Draven Vane's throat, the surrounding fighters on both sides falling silent as they witnessed this decisive resolution to the confrontation that had driven their entire conflict. Draven Vane's expression contorted with a mixture of fury and grudging acknowledgement of his defeat, but before he could respond, either in surrender or defiance, a commotion arose among his remaining forces. Several of his own commanders apparently recognizing that their leader's defeat marked the effective end of any hope for military victory. "Enough," one of the Eastern commanders called out, moving forward to address both his own forces and Cale's assembled fighters. "Draven Vane's ambitions have cost us enough lives already. We will not continue this conflict for the sake of a cause that has clearly failed." This declaration prompted a gradual, uncertain withdrawal among Draven Vane's remaining forces, the tide of battle having shifted decisively with their leader's defeat, and the growing reluctance of his own commanders to continue a fight that had proven far more costly than their initial calculations had anticipated. Cale, watching this withdrawal unfold, finally lowered his weapon from Draven Vane's throat, though he maintained his position of clear dominance over his defeated opponent. "You will be held for formal judgment," Cale said, his voice carrying the authority of a victor who had earned the right to determine his enemy's fate. "Your ambitions have caused enough suffering, Draven Vane. It ends now, permanently, one way or another." As guards moved to secure the defeated Eastern Alpha, Alara found herself finally able to release the breath she had been holding throughout the tense confrontation, the reality of their victory settling over her with a relief so profound it left her momentarily unsteady on her feet. Cale turned immediately to her, his own composure finally cracking as the adrenaline and tension of the battle gave way to the simple, overwhelming relief of having survived and prevailed against the threat that had shadowed their relationship since its very beginning. "It's over," he said quietly, pulling her into an embrace that spoke of everything neither of them could fully articulate in that raw, exhausted moment following the conclusion of the battle. Draven Vane's threat, the danger that has followed you since before you even understood its source, it is finally, truly over. Elara held him tightly, tears of relief and exhaustion finally spilling freely as the weight of everything they had endured together over the previous months finally began to lift. Around them, the battlefield gradually quieted as the remnants of Draven Vane's forces completed their withdrawal, and Kael's own fighters began the difficult work of tending to the wounded and accounting for the losses sustained during the day's intense conflict. But even amid the exhaustion and grief that inevitably accompanied any battle's aftermath, a profound sense of hope settled over Elara as she stood beside Kael, watching the Eastern forces retreat beyond the border that had so recently been the site of such desperate conflict. Whatever challenges still remained, whatever difficult work of rebuilding and healing lay ahead for both Blackthorn Kingdom and the broader northern territories, the specific threat that had shaped so much of her recent life, the danger posed by Draven Vane's 20-year obsession with reclaiming what he believed rightfully belonged to him, had finally, decisively been ended. In the weeks following the battle at the border, Blackthorn Castle gradually transitioned from the tense, urgent atmosphere of active conflict into the more measured work of recovery and rebuilding. The wounded were tended and honored, the fallen mourned with proper ceremony, and the difficult but necessary work of formal judgment against Draven Vane and his remaining conspirators began under Kael's careful, deliberate oversight. The Eastern Alpha's formal trial, conducted before an assembly of representatives from across the northern territories who had contributed to the successful defense against his aggression, revealed the full extent of his 20-year obsession with reclaiming what he viewed as his rightful dominance over the northern regions. Witnesses, including several of his own former commanders who had grown disillusioned with his increasingly reckless pursuit of personal vendetta over genuine strategic interest, testified to the calculated cruelty that had driven not only the original raid on Kael's childhood settlement, but the elaborate scheme to locate and reclaim Elara that had ultimately led to open conflict. "You destroyed an entire community, 20 years ago, in pursuit of territorial ambition," Kael said during the formal proceedings, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through both his victory in battle and his careful, measured approach to justice rather than simple vengeance. "And when that ambition failed to achieve its ultimate purpose, you spent 2 decades nursing a grievance that ultimately cost countless additional lives, all in pursuit of reclaiming a girl who was never yours to claim in the first place." Draven Vane, stripped of the confident, calculating composure that had characterized his earlier interactions, offered little in his own defense beyond a bitter acknowledgement that his ambitions had ultimately proven his undoing. The assembled representatives, after careful deliberation, determined that he would be permanently stripped of his authority over the eastern territories, exiled from the northern regions entirely, his considerable holdings redistributed among more moderate leaders who pledged cooperation with Blackthorn Kingdom and its allies going forward. This resolution, while not offering the complete finality that some among Kael's advisors might have preferred, nonetheless provided a measure of justice that allowed both Kael and Elara to begin the process of moving forward from the shadow that had hung over their relationship since its earliest days. The Eastern Territories, freed from Draven Vane's ruthless ambition, gradually settled into a more stable, cooperative relationship with their northern neighbors, the 20-year tension that had simmered beneath the surface of their interactions finally beginning to dissipate. With the immediate political crisis resolved, Elara found herself finally able to focus on aspects of her new life that had been necessarily overshadowed by the urgent demands of danger and conflict. She spent considerable time reconnecting with her family in Fenwick Hollow, arranging for her parents and younger brother Colin to visit Blackthorn Castle, their reunion filled with equal parts joy and lingering disbelief at how dramatically her circumstances had transformed since the difficult day they had watched her depart with the debt collectors. "I never imagined this could be your life now," her mother said, during their emotional reunion, taking in the grandeur of the castle surroundings with wide, astonished eyes. "When we sent you away, I feared we would never see you again, or that you would suffer under harsh circumstances, we could do nothing to prevent. I understand why you made the choice you did, Alara assured her, embracing both her mother and father warmly. And I am grateful, more than I can properly express, for how everything has unfolded since that difficult beginning. I have found not only safety and security, but genuine happiness, in circumstances I never could have anticipated. Colin, now old enough to more fully grasp the remarkable turn his sister's life had taken, peppered Cale with earnest, curious questions during their visit, clearly fascinated by the king who had not only claimed his sister as an intended mate, but had proven himself, through the trials of the previous months, to be a man of genuine honor and deep personal commitment, rather than the fearsome, cold ruler that rumors had once suggested. You truly recognized her, after all those years, just from a mark on her wrist? Colin asked, during one dinner conversation, his youthful curiosity evident despite his obvious effort to maintain appropriate respect for the king's position. The mark was simply the first thread that led me to a truth I had spent 20 years trying not to hope for, Cale explained, glancing warmly toward Alara as he spoke. But it was who she proved to be, beyond that simple physical connection to my past, that truly mattered. Her kindness, her resilience, her capacity to face impossible circumstances with grace and determination, those qualities, more than any birthmark, are what I have come to treasure most. As winter gave way gradually to the first signs of spring, Cale and Alara began preparations for a formal ceremony to solidify their union, a celebration that would mark not only their personal commitment to each other, but also serve as a symbol of hope and renewal for a kingdom that had endured considerable turmoil over the preceding months. The preparations brought together not only the northern territories that had allied in defense against Draven Vane's aggression, but also cautious, hopeful representatives from the eastern territories, now working to rebuild their own communities under more moderate leadership. Alara found herself, in the weeks leading up to the ceremony, reflecting often on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment, from a frightened girl delivered as payment for her family's debt, to the future queen of Blackthorn Kingdom, standing beside a man who had proven himself, through countless trials and dangers, to be exactly the kind of partner and protector she could never have anticipated finding when she first arrived at the castle's imposing gates. "Do you ever think about how different everything might have been?" she asked Cale, one quiet evening, as they walked together through his mother's garden, now filled with the first tentative blooms of spring. "If you had simply accepted me as payment for the debt, without ever noticing the mark on my wrist. If we had simply lived out our lives, never knowing the connection between us?" Cale considered the question thoughtfully, his expression carrying the particular gravity he reserved for moments of genuine reflection. "I have thought about it," he admitted, "and I believe, even without the mark, even without the memories from that terrible night, I would have found myself drawn to you regardless. Perhaps not with the same immediate, urgent recognition that first conversation in this garden provided, but eventually, through simply coming to know who you are as a person. Your kindness, your intelligence, your quiet strength. These qualities would have revealed themselves in time, mark or no mark, shared history or none at all." Alara smiled at this admission, reaching for his hand as they continued their walk through the garden that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their unlikely, extraordinary relationship. "I would like to believe that as well," she said softly. "Though I confess, I am also deeply grateful for whatever strange twist of fate brought that mark to my wrist, and brought you close enough to notice it, and to remember." The formal ceremony, when it finally arrived on a bright, clear spring morning, drew representatives and well-wishers from across the northern territories and beyond, a celebration that transformed Blackthorn Castle's usually somber, formal atmosphere into something warmer and more joyful than its walls had witnessed in many years. Alara stood beside Cale before the assembled crowd, dressed in a gown that reflected both the dignity of her new position and the simple elegance that had always characterized her personal style, even during her earliest days as a humble kitchen servant. As Cale spoke his formal vows, committing himself not only to their personal partnership, but to the broader responsibilities of ruling alongside her as his queen, Alara found herself overwhelmed by the profound journey that had led them to this moment. She thought of the frightened girl who had arrived at these castle gates months earlier, certain that her life had been reduced to nothing more than payment for an impossible debt. She thought of the cold, distant king, who had barely acknowledged her presence during those early days. His own painful history, hidden beneath layers of careful control and disciplined authority. And she thought of everything that had unfolded between that uncertain beginning and this joyful culmination, the shared discoveries about her true origins, the growing trust and affection that had blossomed despite the dangerous circumstances surrounding them. The courage they had both found to face Draven Vane's twisted ambitions together, rather than allowing fear to drive them apart, and the ultimate victory that had not only secured their personal happiness, but had brought greater stability and hope to the broader northern territories as well. "I promise," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, though his eyes remained fixed solely on Alara as he spoke, "to honor not only the connection that first brought us together, but the woman you have proven yourself to be, through every trial we have faced. I promise to rule alongside you not merely as my queen, but as my equal, my partner, and the truest friend I have ever known. Whatever challenges the future may bring, I promise to face them with you, exactly as we have faced everything since that first evening in my mother's garden." Alara, her own voice steady, despite the emotion evident in her expression, offered her own vows in return, promising her continued commitment to the kingdom that had become her home, to the people who had welcomed her with such genuine warmth despite the unusual circumstances of her arrival, and above all, to the man who had recognized not only the mark on her wrist, but the deeper truth of who she was, offering her a place not merely as a payment for debt, but as someone truly seen, truly valued, and truly loved. As the formal ceremony concluded, and the celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, Alara found a quiet moment to step away from the joyful festivities, making her way once more to the private garden that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in her journey. Cale found her there, standing beside the fountain, watching the last light of the spring evening fade into gentle twilight. "Regretting the festivities already?" he asked with a gentle smile, settling beside her near the fountain's edge. "Never," Alara assured him, leaning into his embrace as he wrapped his arms around her. "I simply wanted a moment to remember everything that brought us here. This garden feels like the true beginning of our story, more than the formal ceremony we just completed." Cale pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his expression carrying a contentment that seemed to have finally, fully replaced the guarded, careful composure that had once defined nearly every interaction he had with the world around him. "Then let this garden remain a place we return to often," he said softly, "a reminder of how far we have come, and a promise of everything still ahead of us." As twilight settled fully over Blackthorn Castle, and the sounds of continued celebration drifted from the great hall behind them, Alara found herself filled with a profound sense of peace and gratitude for the remarkable, unexpected journey that had transformed her from a frightened girl, sold to settle her family's debt, into the beloved queen of a kingdom, finally free from the shadow of old tragedies and 20 years of hidden grief. The mark on her wrist, once simply a curious birthmark she had never fully understood, had ultimately proven to be the thread that connected her, not only to a painful shared history with the man who would become her husband, but to a future filled with genuine partnership, deep affection, and the kind of hard-won happiness that only becomes possible when two people choose to face their greatest challenges together, refusing to let fear or circumstance keep them from the connection they were always meant to find. And as the stars began to emerge above Blackthorn Castle, casting their gentle light across the garden where this extraordinary story had truly begun, both Cale and Alara understood that whatever challenges the future might yet bring, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything before, together, as equals, bound not merely by the mark of a shared past, but by the genuine, enduring love they had built through every trial they had overcome side by side.